back again, are we? You must have a taste for the terrifying. Tonight, we'll explore a story so chilling, it'll make you second-guess every shadow that creeps in your home. It was a rainy night and I was driving home from my shift at the late-night diner I work at. It was a quiet shift at work. I had a weird amount of energy still, so I knew I was going to have to pop a melatonin when I got home. I was driving my usual route, a scenic road during the day but majorly dark at night, lacking many light posts. There are occasional little parking lots with cute little strips of stores or family-owned restaurants and shops, and then just stretches of nothingness. And by nothingness, I mean forest. I was passing one of the aforementioned parking lots of a well-known deli, and under a light post was a woman standing out in the rain with her arm held out. She was waving me down. I slowed as I realized it was a slightly older woman who appeared to be in her 50s, maybe. This woman was really tall, like 5 feet 11 inches or 6 feet, but very skinny. I lowered my window and yelled, "Do you need a ride?" She came over to the front door and opened it, chanting how much of a hero I am. I asked where she was heading, and she said just up the road to town. She was soaking wet, getting my car all wet, but I like to think of myself as a good person and I couldn't, in good conscience, leave another woman out there in the cold rain. However, picking up a random man on the other hand would be a different story. The woman seemed sweet, but I noticed as I looked at her while talking to her that she was missing a few teeth, very, very off-putting. I had to now wonder if she were homeless. She didn't smell or look like a homeless person, though, but the rain soaking her and her clothes could have been masking any scent temporarily. Plus, her hair was so wet that what may have usually been scraggly undone hair could now have been weighted down and straightened by the water. Either way, the woman was smiling the whole time and didn't seem like a threat. We pulled up to an intersection with a gas station on one corner. I pulled in next to a pump, might as well fill up. I asked her if she wanted anything from inside. I was really doing my good deed for the week. She said, "No thanks, honey," so I went inside to pay the attendant for gas and some spiked seltzers since tomorrow was the weekend. When I got back to my car, the woman was gone. I looked around the gas station lot real quick, but it was tiny, she was gone. She must have run off somewhere. I felt slightly bad, feeling like she was some lost helpless woman, but part of me also felt slightly relieved. I filled up the tank of my SUV and was on my way home. When I got back to the house, I went straight inside my apartment, which is the first level of a two-family house. There's a tenant upstairs and me. The front door into the foyer was usually left unlocked, then the 2 doors leading to each apartment were locked. I let myself in out of the rain and into my apartment. I set the seltzers down on the counter. I wasn't that tired yet, so I took a melatonin and tried to go to bed. Even with the melatonin, though, I was having a hard time sleeping that night. My mind was kind of going wild with thoughts, a lot of thinking about that woman I picked up earlier and what happened to her. At certain points, I heard slight sounds from outside of my bedroom, but I dismissed them as sounds from the upstairs tenant. Boy, do I wish I had been more suspicious before falling asleep. I woke up in my dark bedroom, something that usually would never happen when I take a melatonin. I usually sleep like a baby through the night. I sat up, feeling drowsy and really thirsty too. I reached over the table next to my bed for my water, and then I saw and heard something across the room from me. I saw someone crouched in the corner of my bedroom behind a clothing dresser, with their legs folded. I had to be hallucinating it. I shook my head violently and made weird noises. I even slapped myself in the face, and now whoever was in the corner stood up and walked out of the room. I didn't scream, I didn't say a word. I sat in my bed in literal shock. The part that had me questioning my sanity for a bit after the figure was gone was that there wasn't a single sound from outside the room after this. No footsteps, not the sound of a door closing. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. He picked up, confused why I was calling so late. I told him what I just saw, and he said, "Carter, you probably just had a night terror." I stayed on the phone with him as I was continuing to become more awake. I left my room and turned on the lights to the living room outside. It was a small space, there was no one in there. I looked around the entire space and could confirm no one was there. I started to believe that maybe I did just hallucinate it, but still, I slept with the bedroom door locked that night. When I woke up in the morning, I drank some coffee and got dressed for the gym. I went to open the door to the foyer and realized it was already unlocked. My heart sank. Last night, what I saw, was it real? I did another look around the apartment, confirming no one was inside. I went out to my car and opened the back door to put my gym bag in the back seat, and that's when I noticed the damp yellow-brownish stains all over the floor in the back, and my blanket that I always had back there was gone. I wanted to cry or scream. I figured it out. That woman snuck into the back seat last night when I was in the gas station. She either somehow unlocked the door to my apartment, or I mistakenly left it unlocked. I called my dad again, frantically asking him what to do. He said, "Check and make sure nothing was stolen, and if nothing was, then calling the police really wouldn't do anything." I checked the house and didn't find anything to be missing, just my blanket from the car. I skipped the gym that day. In fact, I stayed bottled up in my apartment for a while after that. I was just genuinely disturbed. I didn't want to live there for much longer after that, and so after that month, I found a new place to live. A few months ago, I was driving back to school from visiting my parents. It's about a 2-hour drive, so I usually keep myself entertained with music. I'm a 5 feet 3 inches, 21-year-old female driving my dad's little old pickup truck alone in the leftmost lane of a 3-lane highway, dorking around to the music on the radio. Suddenly, I noticed a semi-truck going the exact same speed as me in the rightmost lane. Embarrassed for getting caught in dork mode, I stopped singing and tried to speed up so he couldn't see me anymore. He matched my speed, which ticked me off a little bit, so I looked at the driver, expecting to see some angry jerk. To my surprise, he was smiling and waving. Thrown off, I kind of chuckled and waved back. Big mistake. He moved over to the middle lane to be closer to me and now wouldn't stop smiling and waving. At first, I played nice, waving back a little because a semi-truck beats a tiny pickup truck any day. But I was mostly focusing on getting out of this guy's field of vision safely. I tried speeding up as fast as my truck would allow and slowing down as suddenly as I could without endangering anyone behind me, but he would just match my speed. If there was someone coming up in his lane, he'd move to the right at the last possible second and pass them before I could slow down and get behind them. He has a lot more practice with reckless maneuvering than I do, so he has me trapped and is using other cars to help him. The whole time, he's smiling, waving, and holding up the number 1 sign for some reason I still don't know. His charm is rapidly fading as this continues for about 5 miles. I got worried and called 911. I gave them a description of the truck: white cargo truck, black cab with some Pennsylvania company logo on it, and the driver was a balding, middle-aged tan guy with a dirty blue t-shirt. They advised me to pull off to the emergency shoulder on the left, but I had never done that and it looked too narrow, so I didn't feel comfortable doing that. At this point, He was passing someone else in the middle lane, and I finally had a chance to slow down and merge 2 lanes over to the rightmost lane. I started speeding past him so he couldn't trap me again. The operator told me to take the closest service plaza about 5 miles away. She said he probably wouldn't follow me, so I could stop there for a few minutes before getting back on the highway. She told me to call if he did follow me, but she was confident he probably wouldn't, so she hung up. Now he's still holding up the sign and smiling this creepy, increasingly perverted grin at me while I avoid eye contact. The service plaza is in a quarter mile, and I'm not using any turn signals, but I guess he knew what I was doing because he braked hard and merged behind me right at the last second to join me in exiting to the service plaza. After I got my heart to start back up from the coronary area just experienced, I called 911 again. The way this service plaza was set up was that semi-trucks had to use a separate lane winding to the right of the plaza that led to a parking lot behind the plaza just for big trucks. The rest of us used a smaller lane to park immediately in front of the plaza. I parked, and as I'm explaining to the new operator what's going on, I watched the semi creep around its path while the driver stared me down, smiling. I freaked out. He knew where I had parked. He knew where to find me. If I just stayed there, I thought maybe I could have floored it to get back on the highway, but I was afraid he would see me and follow me again. So, I drove to a gas station to the left of the plaza, which had a view of the semi-truck parking lot, hoping he wouldn't find me until the police came. The operator transferred me to the woman who was helping me before. She informed me that they had dispatched a couple of police cars but couldn't tell me how long they would be. I saw the trucker had gotten out of his truck and was heading towards me. Even though my windows were closed and my doors were locked, I was panicking on the phone with the operator. She told me the police should be there soon and that I should be safe there, so I should sit tight while I kept her updated. I wanted to at least drive back to the parking lot I was in before, but it was a one-way entrance to the gas station, so I couldn't. I glared at the trucker and showed him my phone when he came close. He finally stopped smiling and made it look like he was going into the service plaza. I looked in my right side view mirror and found him hiding behind a big white pillar in front of the plaza, staring at me again. I freaked out and asked the operator where the cops were and if I could leave because he was being ultra creepy. She told me to sit tight again because they should be there any minute, so I did. Then he came out of hiding and started walking towards my truck. I put it in drive just in case and told the operator what he was doing. I refused to make eye contact with him but kept watching my mirrors to make sure I knew where he was. The smile was back, and he started walking in circles around my truck, looking at it as if looking for a way to get in. I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until he circled back behind me, floored it, and told the operator I wasn't waiting one more second for the police. She apologized and told me the police would look for the man and talk to him if they found him, and that I should focus on getting home safely while keeping an eye out for him. I don't know if they did that or not, but I know none of that would have happened if I had my boyfriend with me. So not only can't I walk alone, but I also can't drive alone as a female. Nice to know. It was December 31st, New Year's Eve. My friend Harry hired me to watch his dog, Bailey, for the weekend while he was out of town for the new year. I'm 34, he's 26, so I don't have that same urge to go out and party for New Year's Eve like he does. I was more okay with making some money and taking it easy for the night. New Year's Eve was on a Saturday. He left for the city early in the day. When I got there, he'd be back Sunday night. He left me with very basic instructions: just feed him and walk him twice a day, and keep him off the furniture. Bailey is a very small husky mix. I'm not sure what else she is, but she's about a third the size of a regular husky, and she's very quiet and well-behaved. Hence why Harry was okay with me watching her instead of a dog sitter. I brought a backpack which contained my laptop, charger, toiletries, and a change of clothes for Sunday. Harry and I don't go way back. We met through mutual friends and had started going out occasionally on the weekends ever since. I would be sleeping in the spare bedroom of his house on the futon. Throughout the day, I just did stuff on my laptop and played some of Harry's video games. Later in the night, I invited my girl over with Harry's permission. His response was, "You better not in my bed," a way of jokingly saying yes, she can come over. She said she'd be getting out of work after 12, but then she'd come straight over. Harry's house is about half an hour from us, so my girl Ratty wouldn't be getting there until late. I had to kill the time alone with Bailey, watching movies until then. We were in the living room, and Bailey was by my feet. It was probably 9 p.m. when the doorbell rang. I went to answer the door, and it was a girl at the door. She looked about 30. She had a hoodie on and was holding a jacket. She introduced herself as Harry's girlfriend and said she left something here that she needed to grab. I offered to grab it if she wanted, and she said no, it's okay, she knew where it was in his room. I said okay, that's fine, and let her inside. She went straight upstairs to Harry's room and slightly closed the door behind her without latching it. I right away texted Harry, "I didn't know you had a girlfriend." She was in there for quite some time until she came back out, still holding her jacket. She came back down the stairs, thanked me, and was going straight for the door. I tried to stop her for a quick conversation, saying, "How long have you guys been dating?" And she said, "Too long," then laughed as if making a joke. I laughed too, and then she said, "Have a good night." I was a bit surprised by the interaction, but what I gathered from it was they had probably just recently broken up. Now I started to worry that maybe I shouldn't have let her in since Harry hadn't answered my text yet. I called him a few times before he picked up. He was out with his friends in a loud setting, so he could hardly hear me until he went outside to talk. I told him his girlfriend just came by to grab something, and he was completely bewildered at what I was saying. "Who are you talking about?" he said. I responded, "She said she was your girlfriend, I didn't get a name." He said in a yell, "You know I don't have a girlfriend." What did she look like? I started to feel really stupid just about now. I described the girl, and he said he had no idea who this could have been. I then proceeded to explain to him that she went upstairs to his room for a few minutes, then came back down. This was when he started freaking out. He told me to go up to his room now and check if she stole anything. Of course, I didn't know what was in his room beforehand, so he had me check for specific things, which all appeared to still be there. He tried hard to figure out who it could have been and said he'd call me back after he made some calls and sent me some pictures of different girls. Understandably, this was putting a damper on his night. I could tell he'd already been drinking, so I felt awfully stupid for letting some random girl into the house. He started sending me screenshots of different girls' Instagram accounts. None of them resembled the girl who came in. When I said no to all of them, he went silent for an hour. Then he texted me randomly, "I think I know who it was. Make sure she doesn't come back." I didn't ask any further questions. I responded, "Okay, my bad," and left it at that. Clearly, Harry was going through some serious girl drama, or so I thought. I watched the ball drop alone, not that I really cared about the new year or the ball drop at all. Later that night, Ratty finally made it over, and so we hung out in the living room together. I told her what happened, and she was shocked. But then a freakish coincidence happened. Bailey lifted her head and looked at the front door, and then there was a knocking at the door. Whoever it was didn't ring the bell. There was no shot I was opening it. I called Harry a bunch of times, but he didn't pick up. He was wasted and didn't even feel his phone vibrating. Ratty and I stayed quiet, and eventually, whoever it was went away. I was honestly unnerved now. Surely it was in connection to whoever that girl was earlier. Maybe it was even her again. Either way, I didn't want to get involved any further in what was going on. After this, we decided to migrate to the spare bedroom where we'd stay for the night on the futon. We had a movie on as we laid down, and I held her. We fell asleep in this position and woke up at some unknown hour in the night, which I later found out was less than an hour after we fell asleep. I woke to Bailey's howling. She was in the room with us. Ratty woke up after me. Bailey was at the bedroom door, with her tail wagging, howling. I whispered, "Bailey, shush." She looked at me and then came over, but she stayed staring at the door, now growling, making unhappy whimpering sounds. Then there were footsteps outside on the wood floors. We heard what had to be at least 2 pairs of footsteps tiptoeing to the door, and then the doorknob twisted. By force of habit, we had the door locked, thankfully, and a girl's voice said, "Harry." I looked at Ratty and signaled for her to stay quiet. That girl was not alone. Another light tap at the door, and then the girl's voice said, "Who's in there? This is Harry's house." I made the decision to say in a loud voice, almost a yell, "The cops have been on their way for a few minutes now, just so you know." The girl said, "Who are you?" I didn't bite. I whispered to Ratty to actually call the police, and she did. The entire time she whispered into the phone. I said loud and clear, "I dare you to do something, because by the time you do it, the cops will be running through the front door." I heard a whisper on the other side of the door, then multiple pairs of footsteps walking away from the door. We stayed in the room waiting for the cops to get there. Since the front door was left wide open by those people, the cops came right in. The house was clear by this point. I gave my entire recount of the story and then called Harry multiple times until he finally picked up, still sounding pretty drunk. One cop talked with him on the phone for a few minutes while I sat with Ratty speaking with another cop. After all this was said and done, the accepted assumption was that there was a key in Harry's room taken by that girl from hours before. This was a pretty messy situation since Harry couldn't just come all the way home this late. He practically begged me to stay the rest of the night. I had rather go home. I stayed because I felt responsible for letting that girl in the first place. I stayed locked in that room the rest of the night with Bailey. I literally wedged a chair against the front door, some half-ass attempt at keeping them out if they decided to return. By morning, though, it seemed that they didn't return. Harry came back earlier that day than originally planned. I'm not going to air out any more private information to the internet than I already have, just in case anyone who knows him can figure out this story is about him. But he did tell me who he thought the girl was, and the story behind it proves that men have to be careful too with the women they choose to interact with. That girl and whoever was with her's intention of breaking in wasn't to steal anything evidently, which is the scariest part. He changed his locks ASAP. I can't even imagine staying in that house if I were him after this. However, it's been a year and as far as I know, nothing has happened unless he's keeping more to the story he told me a secret. After returning from a night to celebrate the arrival of the new year, my husband and I returned to our apartment complex to turn in for the night. We both had a couple of drinks, but neither of us were intoxicated. As much as we enjoy partying with friends, when it comes down to it, we are really just homebodies. We lived in the corner penthouse suite of our complex. Although this was never confirmed, it was suspected the owners wanted to convert this apartment complex into condos. The rent certainly was not cheap, and access was limited to this floor. Upon entering the building, there is a walk-up to secure doors, and every now and then there would be a doorman to greet you as you entered or exited. There were also multiple security cameras placed throughout and around the building. It was an especially cold evening, and when we returned, there was no doorman present. It was late, at least 2:30 a.m. The foyer was empty, and one of the lights flickered softly. My husband and I entered the elevator and pressed the button to the top floor. The elevator ride was smooth, and as we ascended, I could feel myself becoming more relaxed, excited to finally be home and able to rest. My feet were killing me from wearing heels all night in the bitter cold. The bell chimed, signaling we had reached our floor. The door slid open, and we turned the corner to the left. Like I said, our suite was the corner suite at the end of the hall. However, something caught our eye. A woman, or what at least looked like a woman, was meandering through the hallway. Her hair was dark and scattered, it looked to be matted and covered her face. She wore a black lace dress that was torn and looked to be in bad shape. Thinking back, I don't even think she had any footwear on. We assumed she was intoxicated and was having difficulty finding her suite. Although on closer inspection, she didn't look familiar. We knew all of our neighbors, as, like I said, access was limited on this floor. I looked at my husband, who stood still as well. I could see he was contemplating the same thoughts. I asked him, should we ask if she needs help? He looked at me and said, just wait, maybe she's just drunk and having a hard time finding her suite. The woman just continued to slowly slide herself along the walls of the hallway, stopping at each door and peering through the exterior peepholes. Admittedly, this was creepy, but it just added to the theory that she was a drunk woman looking for her friends. She was humming, or what I believe was humming. The sound was something between a growl and a hum. We stood there in utter disbelief and awe. However, there was a veil of tension and uneasiness that lingered. The strange woman stumbled through the hallway, hunched over, until she pulled herself up to peer through the peephole. She eventually got to a suite of an elderly lady, whom I have a strong connection with. We'll just call her Evelyn. Evelyn was the sort of woman whose family had neglected her and rarely visited. She would bring my husband and me baked goods from time to time. I would bring her leftovers and assist her with groceries and medication. Frequently, Evelyn's smoke alarm would constantly go off. I would have to rush over and pull out the smoldering toast from her toaster and fan her smoke alarm until it stopped beeping. At times, a nuisance, but it would always turn into tea time. Nevertheless, I cared about Evelyn. So when I saw this strange woman peer into her peephole, I reacted. I blurted out, "Excuse me, are you all right?" I could feel myself lose confidence as I asked. The strange woman seemed to shudder for a moment and hunched over to the floor. She looked like she was about to puke or was frightened by my voice. My husband and I stepped closer, but the woman then let out a series of soft and menacing laughs, just barely audible. I have to admit, in this moment I was thoroughly creeped out and reached for my cell phone. It was uncomfortable because we couldn't get to our suite. Without having to walk right past this deranged woman, my husband said, "Hey, did you hear us? Do you need help?" Her laugh began to grow into what was a steady cackle. The strange woman then stood up. As she stood up, her cackle became a mixture between a cackle and a boisterous growl. She then stumbled forward and continued walking down the hall. There was a staircase just outside of our suite. I assumed she was making her way to the stairs, just too embarrassed to walk past us to the elevator. Maybe she was just a drunk woman, and this was nothing more than an uncomfortable standoff with a sad and intoxicated woman. I mean, if she was really that drunk, the stairs probably weren't a good idea. We were on the 7th floor. Nevertheless, I just didn't feel like it was worth the risk to engage with this woman. I just wanted to enter my suite and dive into bed. It was late, and my feet still hurt. As we took a few steps forward, the woman stopped, almost with laser precision. She stood up completely straight, looked right at our door, and then began to pound on our door, screaming bloody murder. I could feel myself becoming swallowed with fear. I reached for my cell phone and began to dial 911. The woman kept pounding on our door and screaming. To be honest, I'm surprised none of our neighbors came out to see what was happening. Part of me thinks they were too afraid themselves and were probably peering out of their peepholes. Afraid of what our neighbors would think, my husband said, "Hey, what are you doing? Stop that." And just like that, the strange woman stopped, fell to the ground, and began crawling quickly towards us. She looked up for a brief second. All I could see were her dark eyes. Her mouth seemed to be stained black, and she was growling again, but this time it was as if there was something in her throat that she was choking on. Frozen with fear, my husband and I just watched until she flashed us a menacing hiss, the kind you would hear in a movie but never imagined in real life. Terrified, I whipped off my shoes, and my husband and I ran towards the staircase on the other side of the building. We didn't want to risk waiting for the elevator and have her catching up. We went down 2 flights of stairs and stopped to listen if she was making her way down the stairs, but it was almost impossible to hear as my heart was pounding so hard. I thought to myself, what the hell was going on? We waited there for 10 minutes or so until eventually, we had the courage to head up the stairs and back to our suite. The woman was gone, and so we entered our suite. I was just relieved to finally be safe in my home. My husband sent a text to our landlord, and he replied that we would hear from him in the morning. I was so unbelievably exhausted but found it incredibly difficult to sleep. The sound of that woman's growling and cackling rang in my ears. I hardly slept. The next day, when my husband went to speak to the landlord, he asked him to check the security cameras. Although nothing turned up, the landlord said the cameras glitched due to the frigid temperatures last night. To this day, I still don't know what to think. That woman most certainly had problems. The question is, was she dangerous? We moved about a year later, but every New Year's Eve, I still think about that night. It was New Year's Eve of 2020, and all of us were ready for this horrible year to be over. A couple of years ago, when I was in college, I went to a New Year's Eve party. For a little bit of background, I'm a female and lived on campus but went home for winter break. My parents' house was only about an hour away from campus, and I had a few friends who went back to school early. There was going to be a New Year's Eve party at one of my best friend's houses on campus, so I went back there for it. First, I went back to my college apartment and then arrived at my friend's on New Year's Eve at about 5 p.m. I was one of the first people there, and we just kind of hung out until the other people came over. For a long time, it was a lot of fun, and a lot of my college friends were there, but like many college parties that I went to, things soon became a little bit out of control. A lot more people started to show up at like 10 p.m. or so. The college that I went to is a very large university. I'm not sure how many people attended, but probably well over 25,000 or 30,000. The house soon had a lot of people that I didn't even recognize in it. I was still having a good time, though, until this one guy came up to me. He was a man who looked to be in his 29-year-old and had a tall, somewhat muscular build. Now, he wasn't jacked or anything, but he also wasn't fat. He was just big. He came right up to me, seeming drunk, and started asking me questions about myself. We talked, but not long into the conversation, he asked if I wanted to leave with him. I said no. He kept asking, and I soon walked away. It was very crowded, and the guy followed me all around just about wherever I went. By that point, it was probably midnight, and I decided to just leave. I walked through the crowd of people and found my friends. I told one of them about the guy who was following me, and then I said I would be leaving. I tried to point him out in the crowd, but at that point, I couldn't find him. Then I said bye to my friend, and I left. When I first got outside, I thought that the guy had finally given up. I didn't see him, and I was walking back to my apartment, which was only a few blocks away. But when I started to walk down the street, I heard somebody leaving the house and turned around to see the guy. He yelled at me, asking me where I was going. I told him that I was going home, and he started to walk towards me. Now I was concerned that he was going to follow me all the way back to my apartment. I tried to just ignore him and walk away and hoped that he would stop, but he didn't. I heard him walking down the street after me, trying to catch up. I walked as fast as I could without running. When I made it to where I had to turn, he was still behind me. He was a long way back, so I tried to lose him. I cut through a random person's yard and then went through their backyard. Once I got through there, I cut into the next block over and then walked the other way down the street. This ended up working, and when I got off of that street, I no longer saw him. I was able to make it back to my apartment, and I even checked outside when I got back to make sure that he didn't somehow follow me. Everything was fine, and I went to bed shortly after. The next day, I went back to my parents' house because classes didn't start for college for about 2 more weeks. After driving back home, I arrived sometime in the early afternoon. It was then that I saw I was added on Snapchat by someone. It was a guy named Basil. I didn't automatically assume that it was the same guy from the night before. My college was so big, and I knew a lot of people and didn't have all their snaps. To be honest, I got added by people on almost a daily basis, plus I didn't even recall this guy telling me his name the night before. But after the guy added me on Snapchat, he said hi to me, and I asked him who he was. He responded, saying we met last night, remember? That's when I realized it was the same person. Still, I asked him to clarify. He said he was at the party and then described himself. When he did, I blocked him. I wanted nothing to do with this guy because, after all, he had tried to follow me home. After that, he did not contact me, but the story doesn't end there. That night, I was at my parents' house in my bedroom. I noticed out of my window a car parked on the side of the road out front. It was kind of weird because our neighborhood was quiet, and everybody's houses had long driveways with plenty of space to park. Plus, the car was parked like 20 feet from our driveway. It was a very typical looking sedan, but I couldn't see if anybody was inside or not because it was too far away. I decided to get up and walk over to the window to get a little bit better view. When I did, literally right when I got to the window, I saw the driver's door open. A man got out, and at first, I had no clue who it was. But then the guy came into our driveway and walked along the side of it. When he got a little bit closer, I realized it was the same guy. This really blew my mind. At first, I was not even near campus. I was at my parents' house an hour away. Why was he here? I watched him walk all the way up the driveway, but he didn't go into the front yard. Instead, he went around the side of the house and out of my view. It seemed as though he was going into the back. I hurried out of my room and found my parents. I told them about the guy, and then I called the police. We carefully went to a window in the back of the house and looked out to try to see the guy. It was really dark back there with many opportunities for places for him to hide. We didn't see him, but we knew that he was back there somewhere. For the next few minutes, he remained hidden. Then the police arrived. They came to the front door, and we let them know that the guy was probably hiding in the backyard. Our property was searched, and the man was located. He tried to run away, but was caught before making it off of our property. It turned out that the guy didn't even go to my college. He had found my location through the brief time that he had me on Snapchat because my location was on. This is an experience that is still almost unbelievable to me to this day. I feel lucky that I noticed the car and saw the man get out. If I didn't, I would not have known that it was his car or that he was hiding in the backyard. What he planned to do, I'm not sure, but I'm glad that we called the police. This past New Year's was my and my boyfriend's 4-year anniversary. We typically don't do much, so this year, we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Seattle, and we wanted to rent a cabin in a snowy small town for the weekend. We found a cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub, and we were sold. The cabin was, of course, the last house on the road. To get to it, you had to drive down a small remote private road that ended in a roundabout. Off the roundabout was a long uphill driveway leading up to our cabin. We got to the cabin, and it was snowy and beautiful. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage, and you needed to take stairs on the back side of the property to get to the front door. When we got inside, there was a booklet with all the cabin's info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season, Don't be surprised if their contracted snow plowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Okay, sounds good. So we unpacked and realized that there was no service on either of our phones, but the booklet told us that there was a landline in the cabin if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire, playing board games and drinking wine. The weekend was exactly what we needed. We planned to spend the next day in town, and that night I had booked us a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone almost all day, only returning briefly to get dressed up to enjoy some good food. Dinner was great, and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne and hot tubbing. While at dinner, the temperature had dropped, and it snowed for the first time that day, coating everything in a fresh layer of powder. We drove down the private road and got to the driveway. At that point, my boyfriend stopped the car, headlights shining in front, and asked if I noticed the new tire tracks. I looked at the driveway, hoping to quickly disregard the new tire tracks, but there they were. Immediately, we remembered that the snow plowers could have stopped by, but the issue was we saw the tire tracks because of the snow, and who plows in the dark? We also knew that once we were at the cabin, we had no service on our cell phones. So we figured we would head back into town and message our Airbnb host and ask if they or any of their friends had stopped by. We waited for a while in town for a reply from our host, but we didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point, it was past 10, and we didn't want to be bad guests. We figured we blew the whole thing out of proportion and might as well head back to the cabin. After all, I am big into true crime and spooky subreddits and horror movies, so I was probably just psyching myself out. My boyfriend drove us back. This time, we actually drove up the driveway towards the top of the hill. Part of the driveway, though, I noticed something. My stomach dropped as I noticed footprints on the property. We backed down the driveway and took a closer look to see if there were any more footprints. From what it looked like, someone had driven up the driveway, then reversed down, parked, and then got out of the car and walked all around the property. The property was quite large, with tons of trees and brush, and we knew that these footprints could go anywhere. The moment we saw the footprints, we decided to call the police. We figured it was better safe than sorry, and we would just have the officer go onto the property with us to check everything out. We drove down the road till we got service, called the police, and waited for their arrival. The policeman showed up, and we followed him onto the property. The officer scanned the property and determined there was no one out there. Obviously, we were a little bit shaken up and very embarrassed. We thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us wanted to sit in a hot tub in the dark woods after what had happened. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie with champagne. We were both tired from the day and passed out pretty quickly. At 2 a.m., we both woke up on the couch with the TV on and all the lights laughing about how the night didn't turn out as planned. As my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a noise. It sounded mechanical and only lasted a few seconds. We looked at each other and froze. The garage door. There are very few reasons that someone would need to open the garage door of a guest-occupied Airbnb at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like I said, we woke up with all of the lights on, and the cabin had lots of windows. We knew that if someone was outside, they knew that we were here and that they could see us. I immediately grabbed the landline and dialed 911. Once again, we sat crouched in the Airbnb, praying for the police to arrive. We knew that whoever had made those tracks was still on the property, and this time they were making noise. As I sat talking to the operator, we heard a bang on our balcony as if someone was throwing something up onto it. I was losing my absolute mind when the operator told me the police were nearby. All of a sudden, they were there. We saw the police lights and watched them search everything. Then, soon, we heard banging on the door. It was the police, and we were okay now. At the door were two policemen, one in front of us and one a little behind, kind of kicking around the snow and looking at the ground. I immediately noticed the police officer in the back as the officer who did the initial check on the property. The officer told us that not only was the garage door shut, but it was locked, and again, there were no signs of someone on the property. We discussed leaving, but the officer said the road conditions were too dangerous at that time of night. I looked at the officer who had to come out to the property twice, and I felt I had deeply disappointed him. My boyfriend and I went back inside, locking all the doors again, and we tried to sleep. The next day, we were leaving. While we survived the night, I didn't feel right in the cabin anymore. It was forever the spooky cabin in my head, and I just wanted to leave. As we packed, we heard the same noise that we heard at 2 a.m. That's when I had the realization that it was the heater all that time. It was just the heater in the garage making this noise. My boyfriend looked at me and immediately said, "You need to give up your murder shows," and then walked away. As for the banging on the balcony, it was just a perfectly timed fall of a pine cone. I promise I'm not paranoid. I think back on this story a lot and I'm embarrassed about how little came of it, but also incredibly grateful for the same reason. Around 8 years ago, I moved out of my mom's house into my first apartment in the city of Chicago. The place was a nice 3-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city in a friendly neighborhood by the University of Illinois. I lived with 2 roommates, Patrick and Kelsey. Kelsey was a good friend of mine, while Patrick was a good friend of Kelsey's who I had not met prior, although we ended up getting along just fine. One night, about a month after moving in, I met up with a few friends of mine for drinks at a bar more in the center of the city, around 15 minutes from my place. It was a good time, and I ended up getting slightly drunk before getting into a cab at 1 a.m. and heading home. Upon walking into my apartment, I noticed that Patrick's door was open, showing that he was staying at his girlfriend's place, while Kelsey's door was closed with the light from his TV shining underneath the crack. I made my way to my bedroom and put on my own TV before lying down to prepare for sleep. After around 10 minutes, I heard my doorbell ring. Half asleep, I woke up, confused as it was 1:30 in the morning, so I ignored it. A few seconds later, the doorbell rang again, and then again a few seconds after that. It's important to mention that my roommate Kelsey had a good amount of side cash by dealing weed to a few people. He was also a huge stoner himself, so the idea that he fell asleep while waiting for a late-night customer to come over was not out of the realm of possibility. With this in mind, I went over to my intercom and asked who was there. A girl's voice answered back, "It's Kaylee. I'm here to see Kelsey." Thinking that my suspicions had been confirmed, I exited out of my front door and headed down the stairs. The door to the outside of our apartment building was made of tall glass, so you could easily identify any potential visitors. Here, I saw an attractive college-age blonde girl with glasses waiting patiently outside. I had never seen this person before, however, she appeared to be non-threatening. Besides having random customers over to grab weed, Kelsey would also have some random girls over to hook up with from time to time. Because of this, I let my guard down slightly and cracked the door open. The girl then repeated what she had said moments earlier over the intercom, "Hi, I'm here to see Kelsey." I replied, "Okay, he's here. Just follow me up," and I held the door open for her. She grabbed the handle, and I turned around to head back up the stairs. As I was walking back up, I quickly noticed that this Kaylee girl was not following me up. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that she was still standing outside holding the door open, only now she was staring off to her right, almost as if waiting for someone. At this moment, a tidal wave of fear crashed over me as I realized something horrible was more than likely about to happen. I continued walking up to my place, quicker now. After turning the corner of the stairs, I heard the door swing open and then heavy footsteps running up the stairs behind me. I looked over my shoulder again, and what I saw shook me to my core. A tall, gangly man with sunken-in eyes and greasy long hair down to his shoulders was running up the stairs straight at me. He was wearing a sleeveless black t-shirt, and apart from the cheap-looking tribal tattoos I saw creeping up his arms, I noticed he was also holding what looked like a lead pipe in his right hand. At this moment, my body shot full of adrenaline as I turned around and raced back up the stairs and into my apartment. I turned around to close the door and saw the man, who was now only a few feet from entering my apartment, the pipe over his head. With less than a second to spare, I slammed the door and locked it in one swift motion. Immediately after, I heard the thud of the pipe hit my door. I stood facing the now closed door, paralyzed, as the man hit the door 3 more times while shouting obscenities at me. He eventually gave up and ran down the stairs and out the front door. I ran into Kelsey's room to wake him up. After telling him what exactly had just gone down, he responded by telling me that, yes, he knew a blonde girl named Kaylee, only he had just met her earlier the same day. Apparently, while I was out with my friends, the doorbell rang while Kelsey was home alone. Instead of going down to let her in himself, Kelsey buzzed her up after just hearing her name, thinking she was a friend of mine. When she reached the door to our unit, he opened it and let her in. He said it seemed like she was confused, mentioning that she was looking for someone named Felix. Kelsey responded by saying his own name and that no one named Felix lived here. He mentioned she stayed near the entrance of the unit and kept reaching behind her to make sure the door stayed open before leaving only a few moments later. After hearing this, my theory is that these same people came earlier in the day and, not expecting to have someone just let them up through the buzzer, the girl made the mistake of forgetting to keep the door to the building open, rendering the attacker unable to enter during this first attempt. Either way, we both got extremely lucky that night. We did call the police, who arrived and asked for more information about what happened. They asked if there was anyone we knew who might want to do us harm, and we answered no, which was the truth, as this seemed to be a completely random attack. The cops left soon after, saying that there was nothing much they could do. We never saw that Kaylee girl or her scumbag partner again. I'm sure you've seen some of the more modern videos online where truckers document their daily routines and provide tips for each other. Or maybe you haven't, but being as I'm on the younger side in this industry, every time I open TikTok or YouTube Shorts, that's all I see. I won't get into it, but I had to drop out of a pretty prestigious university for some personal reasons, and people always tell me I could have been more than a trucker. It's honestly not a bad gig though. I've been making deliveries for north of 2 years. Obviously, the only strenuous part of the job is the long hours. You can never truly gauge how the isolation will affect you without experiencing it firsthand. My only advice would be to make peace with whatever demons might be lurking in your subconscious, because they'll definitely eat at your brain in the lonely hours. That's what happened to me anyway. This happened to me 3 months after getting employed by my first company. I was basically as new in this trade as one could get. I was driving from southern New Jersey to Lafayette, Indiana, a 12-hour drive. 12 hours driving might not seem that crazy, but factor in the fact that I had just completed an 8-hour trip, and that should put things into perspective. I wanted to get deliveries done as quickly as possible, so I opted to drive through the night. I did to Lafayette just before 3 a.m. Things were going smoothly. There were virtually no other cars on the road, so I was able to push the semi a little faster than normal. About halfway through the drive, I remember reaching down at the center console to chug a Red Bull, but there weren't any. Of course, I had forgotten to restock my truck after completing my previous delivery. After slapping my dashboard a few times, I groaned in frustration, knowing I'd have to stop somewhere. There was nothing I hated more than having to make stops during my drives. I might be unique in this, but I always get exponentially more tired when my vehicle is immobile, even if I'm only stopped for like 20 seconds. After glancing up at the navigation, I figured I had no choice, either fall asleep on the road or stop and get an energy drink. In my brain, those options were pretty much equivalent. Reluctantly, I pulled into the first service stop I saw. I had literally no clue where I was, probably somewhere in Ohio at this point. Too late, I realized this wasn't actually a service stop. It was what looked like an abandoned gas station and a repurposed convenience store. Not sure if there's any better way to describe it. Either way, it looked like there was another quick stop store not far up the road, so I figured I'd go there if anything. I parked the semi. I made my way over to the first convenience store. To be completely honest, I was expecting one of two things to happen. Either the place would be open, or the door would be locked. You can imagine my surprise then when the door swung open into a pitch-black store. I looked around, hoping maybe I'd get lucky and there would be a drink or snack left behind. Just before I was about to turn around, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I picked up on a faint glow emanating from the corner of the room. I made my way over to it, and the glow turned out to be coming from a back room of some sort. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the door slowly. To my pleasant surprise, there was a plugged-in refrigerator against the wall. Eagerly, I opened the door but found nothing. Literally nothing. The shelves had been removed, the whole appliance had been gutted. As I was shutting the door, I was 90% certain I heard a clatter from the main room, like something hitting the floor. I froze for a good 10 seconds. Had I imagined it? There was no way. Quietly, I walked back into the main room and looked around. Nothing. Part of me wanted to keep investigating, but I didn't have time for this. I walked out the entrance door and basically jogged to the other shop. It was open, thank God. I paid for my drink and made it back to my truck. Something about this whole stop felt wrong. I needed to get back on the road as soon as possible. I took one last glance at the abandoned store and noticed the door was now open. I was 100% positive I had shut it behind me. It wasn't my job to figure out what was going on here, so I started the engine and merged my semi back onto the highway. The caffeine started kicking in and snapped me out of my tired haze pretty quickly. My mind began to wander, and I started thinking about how bizarre that whole thing had actually been. I guess a squatter or an abandoned building wasn't the strangest thing in the world, but my brain couldn't explain that refrigerator, no matter what theory I thought of. I tried to forget about it and kept driving. It was then that I started noticing weird movements in the curtain behind me. Sweat started dripping down my forehead. I watched in the rearview mirror as the curtain seemed to billow and move, even though I didn't have the air on. I thought the worst, there was someone in my truck. I didn't have any weapons on me or anything, so I discreetly punched in the nearest police station on my phone. The drive there was the most tense and horrifying 20 minutes of my life. I kept imagining that person reaching out to grab me or trying to crash my truck. Finally, I approached the police station. I stopped the semi as close as I possibly could get and basically ran over to the police station. In seconds, my truck was surrounded by police, and after I opened the back, what I saw will stay with me for life. The police pulled out 3 homeless-looking people, 2 men and 1 woman. They were wearing rags and were wrapped in nasty-looking blankets. One of the men was armed with 2 switchblades. All 3 of them refused to talk but stared menacingly at me as they were getting cuffed. I have no idea what they wanted. I don't think I'll ever know. I was 18 when my parents went away on a week-long anniversary trip. My sister had already moved out by this point, so I had to hold the fort. My parents' property is enclosed by woods and a dirt driveway leading to the road. The road is a quiet back road with equally sized properties running alongside it, all of them separated at a decent distance. So it's a really isolated feel up there. Everyone in town knows each other. You see familiar faces all the time, for the most part, at the gas station, the grocery store, the bars, which I'd learn a few years later when I started going to them. Speaking of gas stations, this story starts one day while my parents were away. I was at a gas station filling up my tank when a black Jeep Cherokee pulled up to the pump next to mine. A man with a goatee stepped out, greeted me, and started filling his tank. In that town, it was normal for strangers to greet each other like that. He had his nozzle locked into the gas tank, and then he walked around to my side of the pump and went, "Excuse me, do you know how to get to the interstate from here?" I helped him to the best of my ability. He pulled out a notepad and started writing down the directions I gave him. Very odd how he wouldn't just do that on his cell phone like anyone else would. He thanked me and asked if I'm from the area. I said yeah, I grew up here, and he said he's from out of town. He didn't specify where. He then went back to his side and put the nozzle back in the pump. He then asked my name as he said, "It's nice meeting you." I said, "My name's Aaron." He said, "What a lovely name," and then got in his car. As I got into mine, I drove out first and turned left to go up the road back home. It was only a few minutes worth of driving before I was approaching our turn into the driveway. I slowed down, put my blinker on, and then turned right onto the property. It was at that moment that I noticed the car behind me was that same black Jeep Cherokee. He passed me as I turned into our driveway. He went the complete opposite way that I told him to go to get to the interstate. As he passed me, he didn't slow down or anything, so it seemed that maybe he just forgot the directions I gave him and went the wrong way. I let myself inside and went about the rest of my day doing whatever. I think it was that night that I was going out to meet up with my friends. I stepped outside, walked to my car, and heard the sound of footsteps nearby. Like I said, the house is enclosed by woods, and this was in the middle of the summertime. It could have been any number of animals, so I didn't investigate. I just got in my car and left. But when I got back home hours later and walked from my car to the house, a man's voice from out somewhere in the woods called out, "Aaron." I got the chills as I looked around and then, in a panic, rushed to open the front door. I slammed it shut and sat on the couch to breathe. The neighbors all knew my name, but the houses are not on top of each other, so it's a bit of a walk, and there was no reason for one of them to call my name like that, like a creep, and not identify themselves. I decided to call my parents to tell them, and their explanation was it must have been one of the neighbors and they'll probably knock on the door. I didn't tell them about the encounter at the gas station. The next day, which was a Saturday, I stayed home most of the day. Later that night, I once again was going out to meet with my friends. After getting ready and everything, I went outside, and as I was walking to my car, I heard loud and clear from the not-so-far distance, someone called, "Aaron." Again, this time I didn't wait a second. I ran back inside the house and locked the door. Again, I called 911, this time texting my family while doing so. After 2 cops showed up to the house, they looked around the perimeter of the property with their flashlights, then came back and said to call again if this persisted. I didn't feel much better after this. It's not really like they did much. Going outside until the next day when I had work, I was a server at a nearby restaurant. I was working a late shift. I left the house in broad daylight, paranoid to hear that voice again. Thankfully, though, I didn't. Maybe seeing the police car finally scared them off. After many hours at work, I was ready to go home and collapse into bed. I pulled onto the property, parked my car out front, and walked to the front door. I stopped when I heard the sound of footsteps again. It didn't sound like an animal's footsteps, though. I stood on the front deck for a second, waiting, and then that familiar voice yelled out again, saying, "Aaron, don't call the cops on me again." "Cutie," I yelled out, "you need help, you're sick," and let myself inside. I called the cops once more, and the cops came again, searched the perimeter again, and left. My parents told me I should stay at a friend's house for the night. I couldn't agree more. They would be back the following night, so after that, I would feel much safer being there. My friend Fidelia told me I could stay with her that night, so I packed a bag and was ready to go. I checked out the windows first to make sure the coast was clear. I then went outside and locked the door as fast as I could, then ran to the car. As I turned the key in the ignition, I heard something right to my left. Right outside the driver's side door was a man wearing a face mask trying to open the door. I couldn't even scream. I felt like I was choking on air. As I put the car in drive, he started hitting the glass with his elbow. I looped my car around on the grass and sped down the driveway, and I turned right up the road and didn't stop until I got to Fidelia's house. I was hysterically crying the whole drive there, as I had Fidelia and her dad on the phone with me. He said he would have come and picked me up had he known the situation. We called the police together for a third time in total. A couple officers went to my parents' house to investigate again, make sure no windows were shattered or anything. One officer came to Fidelia's house, where I once again gave my description of what happened. This was probably the most action these cops had seen in a long time in this quiet town. Thankfully, my parents came home the next day, and I felt safe staying at home again. I fully believe the man at the gas station followed me home intentionally and scoped the place out, realizing I was by myself and, for whatever reason, toyed with me until he actually tried to pounce and get me. I shouldn't have given my real name, and I should have been more alert to my surroundings and realized he was following me in my car that day. Some people are nuts and have way too much time on their hands. This incident was a huge motivating factor in my moving out to my own apartment a few months later. My island on June 28, 1947, Captain Tony, who worked as a harbor patrolman officer in Island, was on patrol with his two rookies, his son, and his dog. However, this was no ordinary day at sea. When Tony gazed up into the sky from his patrol boat, he saw 6 aircraft floating around 1,500 feet above his watercraft. The objects were reported by Tony and his crew to be made of a reflective material and were shaped like flat donuts, about 100 feet in diameter. The center holes located on each craft were noted to be about 25 feet in diameter, and more circular objects were located along the sides of the aircraft, which Tony and his crew determined to be observation windows. Soon, Tony and his fellow crewmen noticed that 5 of the UFOs circled over the 6th, and the 6th itself was lowering towards the patrol boat. This caused immense panic among the crew because they all thought that the aircraft was going to collide with their patrol boat. Not wanting to be sent to a watery grave, the crew hightailed it toward the shore. Upon reaching the shore, Tony retrieved his binoculars to spot the bizarre aircraft from the shore. He also grabbed his camera to take photos as evidence of the strange aircraft. While taking the pictures, the lower craft stayed in a still position while the 5 others circled around it for about 5 minutes. Then, the lower aircraft suddenly dropped down but stopped abruptly at about 500 feet above the water. One of the 5 ships circling around the lower ship came down to meet it. The two crafts stayed in this position for several minutes until Tony thought he heard a thump. Instantaneously, more thumps followed, and Tony, using his binoculars, saw that the middle aircraft was dropping what Tony suspected to be newspapers from the inside of its center hole as it swiftly approached his watercraft. When the aircraft got close enough, it was discovered that the objects weren't newspapers but instead white, lightweight metals and black, lava-like rocks. Tony even stated that when the lava-like rocks landed in the sea, it caused the water to steam. With these dangerous pieces of debris falling ever closer to their boat, the crew sought cover below deck. However, not before one of the materials struck Tony's dog, killing it in the process, and another one wounded his son in the arm. Tony even tried to radio for assistance, but the transmitter wasn't functioning. Even though his radio was out of action and no help was on the way, most of the debris splashed into the water. Soon after the raining of metals and rocks, the airships rose up high into the sky and zoomed westward together. The crew then exited the lower deck and examined the boat for any damage. Luckily for the crew, the boat was hardly damaged, and they set sail back to their dock, lowering the dog over the side and into the water in the form of a burial at sea. Upon docking, Tony took his son to the hospital so that his wounds could be treated and afterwards explained the incident to his boss, Mark, who didn't believe Tony. When the photos Tony took of his patrol were printed and examined, the strange airships Tony had informed him of and showed him in the now-developed photos were compared and believed to be film noise and damage caused by radiation. Not wanting to shy away from proving the incident's authenticity, Tony returned to island to collect rock samples in hopes of finding the ones dropped from the middle aircraft that he had encountered during the incident. Tony reported that while he did this, he spotted one of the aircraft hovering above him as if it were spying on him. He eventually gathered the rocks and was preparing to show them to his boss the next day. But when that day came, he was visited by a small, pale man in a black suit. The man suggested that the pair of them should get breakfast together, to which Tony agreed. So, he followed the stranger to a restaurant. While they ate breakfast together, the strange man asked no questions but instead gave a descriptive account about what Tony had witnessed the previous day and eventually warned Tony that bad things would happen not only to him but to his entire family. Men then acknowledged that Tony had been telling the truth. So, the pair of them sent a package to publisher Ray Palmer in Chicago, who later founded Fate magazine. The contents inside the package were the metal fragments and statements about the strange incidents and findings on the 21st and 22nd of June, a noteworthy incident that we continue to discuss and debate amongst ourselves to this day. Yet not even a month later would another incident occur that is possibly the most well-known and talked about alien encounter in history, Roswell. On July 8, 1947, in the small town of Roswell, New Mexico, there were reports of a flying disc that crashed into the desert not far from the Walker Air Base. This made front headlines around the world. The reports noted that bodies of aliens had been retrieved from the crash site and were hauled to the infamous Area 51 Air Base in the Nevada desert, where autopsies were performed and carried out. Shortly afterwards, a press release by high military authorities stated that rumors of a flying saucer had become something of a reality and that an intelligence officer at the Roswell Army Airfield was fortunate enough to gain and hold possession of one of the saucers. This statement sent newspaper reports of the incident around the world insane, and news headlines of this Roswell flying saucer were everywhere. However, just 24 hours later, that high military authority changed their story, stating that they had made a mistake and that the flying saucer was actually, in fact, a weather balloon. Unbelievably, the public appeared to have accepted this explanation, and very little was said about the Roswell incident for many years afterwards. It wasn't until the late 1970s when some military personnel involved began to speak out about what happened all those years ago, and ufologists, as well as conspiracy theorists, went into overdrive, thus developing the Roswell case into the incident as we know it today. One of the first military personnel to speak out about the Roswell UFO incident was Major Jesse Marcel. He was one of the two military personnel sent to investigate the crash site. The other one who was with Major Jesse Marcel was Sheridan Cavett, who had always claimed that he wasn't even there. Major Jesse Marcel described how large amounts of metallic debris were scattered all over the area, so the craft had obviously hit the ground at a high speed. He stated that it was clearly not a weather balloon, aircraft, or missile because he recovered fragments from the crash and described seeing hieroglyphic types of writing painted on it. The metal was also reported by him to be light, thin as paper, but incredibly strong and hard, which was unlike anything he had ever seen in his career and life before. He also helped answer the question as to where the fragments were taken by simply saying not only did they have the one he analyzed but others as well, which are being kept well preserved in a military installation somewhere. Marcel's story doesn't end there, however, because later in life he told his expanding family about his investigation at Roswell. According to his grandson, my grandfather Marcel would privately share details of his experiences with the entire family. And when I was a kid, basically around the dinner table, he told us how he was the head of intelligence and lead investigator of the 509 bombing group. He would talk about it with people, continuously asking a multitude of questions about the Roswell UFO incident. The National Security Agency published a report in 1994, a staggering 47 years after the initial incident, which stated that the alien bodies supposedly recovered from the crash site were, in fact, just life-size test dummies. Many saw this as the government just trying to dig itself out and cover up the situation, which only continued to fuel conspiracy theories. Lots more witnesses came forward and spoke out about the Roswell UFO incident, including a photographer who claims that he was asked if he could photograph the crash site. He explained how he was asked to take photos inside a dark-tinted area where he observed 4 identical bodies with humongous heads and shadowy skin. After taking the pictures, he was debriefed and ordered to forget everything he noticed at the crash site. But then a witness more credible than everybody else combined spoke out just before he passed away in 2005. His name was Lieutenant Walter Hutt, the man who published and released the original weather balloon report back in 1947. Before his passing, he wrote and left a sworn affidavit in which he claimed that the weather balloon story was a cover-up for the UFO that had been successfully recovered from the crash site. He also confirmed that he had seen dead alien bodies in this still widely debated Roswell UFO incident. With these two incidents raising so much speculations and questions, one might ask if we will ever know what went on. However, as the years fly by and as the people who were involved or witnessed these incidents pass away, we are really only drifting further away from the inevitable answer. So until the government sheds light on this mystery or the next incident does that for us, we can only continuously marvel at the fact that these two instances combined have been not only the gateway to extraterrestrial debates as we know them today, but also might just be the biggest government cover-ups in history regarding human contact with alien and otherworldly beings. Though these two events are the most widely renowned encounters with extraterrestrials, thousands of encounters have been reported throughout the world to the present day. I never told anyone this story because I never thought they would believe me. I was home alone one evening and had gone to sleep for the night. I lived with my significant other and 2 indoor cats, but she was out of state traveling for business. This is the story of my freshman year in college. I went to a smaller university. There were only a few thousand students that attended it, so the campus wasn't very large. But I liked that about this place. However, my first year I had to live in the dorms to save a little bit of money and maybe make a friend. I chose to have a random roommate. This decision backfired. I didn't know anybody at the college when I got there, and the first person that I met was the roommate. He told me that his name was Dermot. Dermot was a strange guy overall. He was rude, unfriendly, and he never left the room other than to go to class. He was not at all the type of person that I would normally hang out with, and by the second week, I had given up all hope of being friends with him. I had a TV and a PS4 that I brought with me to school, and Dermot said that I could never use it because it bothered him. He also demanded that all lights be off after dark. I tried to reason with him once, but he threatened to report me to the dean of students. I wasn't scared by the threat. I didn't really think they would do anything. But I would rather just try to get along with my roommate instead. I would do my studying in class buildings around campus. I made other friends at college pretty quickly, and when I was talking with them about Dermot one day, they suggested that I get a new room. I hadn't even realized this was an option until they told me, so I put in a request to get my own solo dorm room. I was told that when one came available, they would contact me. About 2 weeks later, so now about a month and a half into the school year, I was contacted. I was told that I could move into a different dorm building that was across the street. This building was a little bit newer and nicer. It had a room that was available, and I accepted it. I decided not to even tell Dermot. I didn't know if he would be happy or sad about it, but I didn't want him thinking that I hated him or something. So one day, when Dermot was gone at his classes at a time that I didn't have class, I packed up all my stuff and just left without saying a word. My entire half of the room was now gone. I moved into my new building and got my new room. It was so nice to finally have a place all to myself. I could watch TV, play PlayStation, and not have any complaints. I could even have my friends over to hang out. However, I did want to be careful not to see my old roommate Dermot. Like I said, it was a small campus, so there was a chance that we would cross paths. If we did, I didn't want him to ask me why I left or something. I was careful to avoid him, and I didn't see him at all for a couple of days. As for my new room, at first it was great, but on probably the second or third night that I was there, something happened. I was playing video games late at night, and I heard somebody try to open my door. It was locked, so it didn't open. After a few seconds, I got up to look out of my peephole. When I was walking towards the door, I heard somebody knock on it. There weren't even that many people that knew I lived here yet, so I found this to be really strange. When I got to the door, I saw Dermot standing there. I did not want to answer it, and I quietly moved away from the door. He knocked one more time, and I didn't answer that either. I was really creeped out. I mean, how did he even know that I lived here? I didn't tell him, and I wasn't friends with him on Snapchat or anything where he could see my location. This was really strange. I went back and looked like 15 minutes later, and he was finally gone. I didn't know why he came here. There was no reason that I could think of. Well, the next morning I got up and had to go to class. When I left my room, I walked down a couple of hallways to get to the front of the building. In one of the hallways was a sort of lounge study area. When I was approaching it, I saw Dermot sitting in one of the chairs there. I couldn't believe that he was in my dorm building. He didn't live here. I didn't know what he was doing. I turned around and left out of another exit. I thought maybe he was following me. It was really, really strange. Later on in that same day, I was walking on campus, and I happened to notice him again. There were a lot of other people walking around, and I saw him a ways behind me. I walked back to my dorm building, and he seemed to almost follow me there. He wasn't walking close enough to follow me inside or anything, but I was very suspicious when I noticed. I got back in my building and was wondering what this guy's problem was. Well, that same night he was back at my room once more. I was up late, and he tried entering. It was locked like always, and he then knocked on the door. This time it was louder than before. I didn't answer, but was watching him through the peephole. He knocked again very loudly, but I still did nothing. When he knocked for a third time, I remember somebody else who lived down the hall opened up their door. They told him to quiet down. Dermot didn't say anything. Then he stood there for probably a minute. After that, He backed up a step and then kicked my door extremely loud and hard. I was honestly afraid that the door might break, but it didn't. Dermot then turned and stormed off. After this, I made up my mind that I was going to report him, and the next day I did. Somebody must have talked to him or something because I stopped seeing him after that, and he did not return to my room. I was still very suspicious that he would follow me around or show up again or something for like a month, but luckily he didn't. A while after this, I met somebody that used to know him. They weren't really his friend but had several classes with him. They told me that he had dropped out and also said that his name wasn't even Dermot. None of these things really surprised me. I'm not sure why he gave me a fake name, but he was a weird guy. Looking back, I'm really glad that I moved out when I did. When things hit the fan with my parents, I had to move out. I was down on my luck living situation-wise and could only crash on the couches of my friends for so long. I was looking on all the roommate and apartment apps and websites, and I found something that caught my eye on this app. A man named Owen had listed a room for rent in his 3-bedroom, 1-story house. The rent price was $1,300 a month. He'd basically be my landlord and roommate as he would also be living in the house. He made sure to note on the ad that he'd be out of the house most of the time and that the renter would have the place to themselves often. He did put in all capital letters a few ground rules though, including no parties, no large gatherings, no drinking in the living room, and no use of the basement. They seemed like pretty standard rules. I went to view the house in person and meet Owen. The second he opened the door, I got a bit of a read on him that he was a little reclusive. His demeanor was quiet and a little awkward. He showed me the house, and I could tell he was nervous because his voice would shake and he would stutter. The bedroom was a good size and the actual floor plan of the house was good. It was an open layout, meaning the kitchen, living room, and dining room were all one big open space. For $1,300 a month in my area, it was a steal. He laid out some more ground rules in person and he emphasized again how I can't go in the attic or the basement as he used them for storage only. Sounded fair enough. On the spot, I told him I was interested. We shook hands, I left, and 2 days later I was moving in. We didn't draft any sort of lease or contract. I was just going to be paying him off the books month to month, the first day of every month. I had settled in pretty quickly. The bedroom I was renting was already furnished with a bed and basic furniture, so all I did really was hang some of my wall decor and fill the dresser and closet with clothes. The bedroom had a lock on it, thankfully, and he gave me the key to it so I could lock it when he wasn't home, which seemed like a nice gesture at first. Owen never told me what he did for work. He just told me he usually wouldn't be home, but I quickly learned that wasn't true. Anytime I'd come home from work, his car was always in the driveway. Quickly, I started to pick up on loud sounds outside of my bedroom at night, from footsteps to doors opening and closing constantly. One night, I went out in the middle of the night just to go to the bathroom and I noticed the basement door was opened. I walked over to the top of the stairs and looked down. There was a dim light from down there, seemingly from a far corner out of view. I heard banging sounds coming from down there. It was like 2 a.m. What could he be doing down there? Then the banging stopped and Owen appeared at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at me. It was so creepy that describing it in words doesn't do it justice. He looked visibly annoyed as he looked up at me. I apologized and said I was just going to the bathroom. He almost angrily responded, "Shut the basement door." I listened to him, insanely weirded out. I went to the bathroom and then back to bed. I laid awake for a while after that, now with my mind racing, wondering what he was doing. About a week later, I returned home and noticed my bedroom door was unlocked. I always locked it before leaving every day. I looked around my room to see if anything was missing, and while nothing seemed to be missing, I noticed some things had been moved. For starters, my clothes in the dressers were not neatly stacked anymore. They had been looked through, I could tell. The closet door was also cracked open. It was dawning on me that he had his own key and he likely came into my room and went through my stuff. This felt like a clear invasion of privacy and a violation of my tenant rights. I had to figure out how to confront him about it. I went to knock on his bedroom door, but he didn't answer. His car was in the driveway once again, so he had to be home. I was getting such weird vibes from all this. I gave up and went back to my room after microwaving my dinner. While I was in my room relaxing and watching TV, I heard the door to Owen's room open. I took this opportunity to get up and confront him, so I went out to the living room and caught him in a hurry about to leave the house. I stopped him and asked if he went into my room. He looked at me with a blank expression and straight up said no. I delicately responded without being hostile, saying that the door was unlocked and some of my stuff appeared to have been gone through. He then claimed that I had the only key to my bedroom, and then he said he's in a hurry, he has to go, and he left. I was flabbergasted by all of this. I wanted to ask my parents for advice, but at that time, I hated them and wanted nothing to do with them. I was already back on the apps and websites looking up other listings. I knew I didn't want to stay here. Then I realized this was the first apparent time that Owen wasn't home while I was. Curiosity got the better of me, and I had to check out the basement. I checked out the windows first to make sure his car was gone, and it was. I then went over to open the basement door. Oddly enough, I couldn't find any light switches, so I just used the flashlight on my phone to navigate around. The steps were so creaky I felt like I was in an abandoned house. I got to the bottom, and there was a tan carpet that was curling upwards at the walls as if it were poorly fitted to the floor. It was a very small basement, at least the main room there was. There was just this one ugly couch in the middle of the room. There was also a slightly funky smell down there, and the smell only got worse as I got closer to this door in the corner. I attempted to open the door, but unfortunately, it was locked, or maybe I should say fortunately, because I'm not sure I fully wanted to know what was in there admitting that smell. It almost smelled like raw sewage, but worse. I did one little quick sweep around the main room of the basement and found nothing, just some taped up cardboard boxes, which I was not going to open. I went back upstairs and shut the door. The rest of that night, I stayed in my room. I never heard Owen come back. He must have gotten back after I had fallen asleep. I woke up, the room was still dark. My alarm was not going off, something else had woken me up. I heard the floor next to my bed creak, and I turned and saw Owen leaning over my bed, looking at me. I screamed, and he replied to me to shush and then asked me if I went into the basement. I screamed no. How did you get in here? I locked the door. He then asked me, are you sure? I flipped the cards on him and yelled, did you come into this room when I wasn't home? He replied no, then turned around and walked toward the door. I asked, how did you get in here then? I saw him hold up his hand in the dark. He wasn't holding anything at the time, I didn't know what it meant. He said to me before leaving the room, I think you should find other living arrangements, and then he closed the door. I started packing right then and there. I wasn't staying another minute in that house. I knocked on his door and yelled at him to give me half of the rent money back since I'd only been there like 2 weeks. Moments later, he opened the door, and just his arm stuck out from the door holding a small stack of $100 bills. He managed to make even handing me the money insanely creepy. I grabbed it. It was only $400. Whatever, it was close enough. I just wanted to get out of there. I was fully packed and out of there within an hour. I slept in my car that night. I ended up back at my parents' house the next day, and after explaining the ludicrous events I just went through, something changed where they were more welcoming to have me back. I still moved out a month later, but my parents and I are fine now. If you're choosing to have a random roommate from online, just be careful and use your best judgment after meeting them. Ever since I was a kid, I loved carnivals. The lights, the games, the unpredictable joy of it all. I know lots of people find them weird and childish, but not me. Growing up in a small town in Indiana, it's not like there was a whole bunch to do. So whenever the carnivals would roll through town, you best believe I was spending as much time there as I possibly could. It's been over 20 years, and I still enjoy the atmosphere of a local carnival. Despite what I'm about to tell you, I think my love for carnivals is something I'll never lose. I was like 9 or 10 when this happened, and I was a kind of nerdy kid growing up. In the days leading up to the spring carnival, I found myself in the library reading up on whatever I found interesting at the time. For whatever reason, I wound up in the history section. I remember the books being literally caked in layers of dust. That's how long it had been since they were even touched. I was flipping through a book on the history of our town when a small, faded slip of paper fell out from between the pages. Confused, I leaned down to pick it up. To my pleasant surprise, it was a ticket for our local spring carnival, dated over 15 years ago. The odds of something like that happening had to be extremely low. I was ecstatic. This ticket would make a great addition to my miscellaneous collection back home. What was even cooler, though, was the fact that the date on the ticket was just 2 days away, when the carnival would certainly be in town. As I predicted, the carnival cruised into town the next morning, so I figured, why not use the old ticket just for laughs, to see what the booth attendant would say. I wanted to get it punched anyway. The next evening, I headed to the carnival with the ticket safely tucked away in my pocket. As I approached the entrance, the carnival seemed just as lively as ever, the air filled with the scent of cotton candy and popcorn. I pulled out the ticket at the gate, handing it over to the guy at the booth. His face changed the moment he saw it. He went pale, his eyes widening slightly before he masked his reaction with a forced smile. It was honestly a little creepy. Enjoy your evening," he stammered, handing me back the ticket without punching it. I was so weirded out by his reaction that I forgot to ask him to punch it. I shrugged it off, though, thinking maybe he was just new and confused about the old design of the ticket. I wandered around, played some games, and enjoyed a funnel cake. The night was perfect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I felt eyes on me, observing. Maybe it was just paranoia. I tried to ignore it at first, but I kept noticing the carnival employees giving me weird looks. After a while, I got fed up and decided to ask one of the older game operators about it. I found a kindly-looking elderly man running the ring toss booth. I showed him the ticket, and unlike the booth guy, he didn't even try to hide his shock. He glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "Young man, where did you get this?" he asked. After telling him where I found it, I started feeling uneasy about the whole situation. Maybe I should have just kept the ticket at home. "You found something you weren't meant to find," the old man started, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This ticket, it's part of a story that the folks around here don't talk about much. About 15 years ago, something terrible happened during the carnival right here in this town." He paused as if weighing whether to continue. There was a young worker, name of Win, nice kid, everybody liked him. He was responsible for one of the rides. I can't remember which. One night, he just disappeared, vanished without a trace. The police found his wallet, but there was nothing in it except a ticket that looked an awful lot like this one, he said, gesturing towards my hands. The atmosphere around us seemed to drop a few degrees. He continued, they searched everywhere, even drained the local pond, but no sign of him. After that, strange things started happening every time the carnival stopped here, accidents, things going missing, odd sightings. People said it was when trying to come back, or something worse that took him. I could feel a chill running down my spine, but a part of me was skeptical. And you believe that? I asked. The old man shrugged. I've seen enough to keep an open mind. But the point is, the ticket you found might stir things up. It's best you get rid of it. Leave it here. He then motioned for me to give it to him, but I was reluctant. I looked down at it, reading it over again as if there was some kind of secret I was missing. How could a ticket be the cause of all that? I questioned, still not fully buying it. The look in his eye got darker, his tone switched almost as if he were angry. Give it here, he told me, almost in a growl. I considered it but concluded that some stupid story wasn't worth giving up such a cool souvenir. I told him no, and he actually sprung up with a quickness that startled me. He reached for the ticket, his fingers grazing my hand. I jerked back instinctively, clutching the ticket tighter. The old man's expression morphed into something desperate, almost predatory. You don't understand, he hissed, his eyes darting around as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. I backed away towards the tense exit, my heart pounding. I think I should go, I stammered, turning to lose myself in the crowd. Behind me, I could hear his calls, a mix of pleading and warning. I didn't care what he was saying though. I let the bustling crowd around me drown his voice out. My mind was racing, not even about the ticket, but more so his aggressive reaction. The joy of the carnival had been spoiled. I left earlier than planned, the ticket burning a hole in my pocket. Over the next few days, my luck seemed to turn sharply. I missed catching the school bus, scraped my knee pretty bad in a bike accident, and worst of all, my best friend accused me of stealing his favorite baseball card, something I would never do. Things got worse than that, though. I remember coming home one night to my mother in tears after losing her job. My brother broke his leg skateboarding the next week, and our beloved family pet, Bean, also passed away a few days after that. It was like a dark cloud had settled over me since that night at the carnival. I couldn't help but remember the old man's warning about the ticket stirring things up. It seemed ridiculous, but then again, so was the string of bad luck that followed me. My dad laughed when I told him about my theory. He told me that there was no such thing as ghosts and that I shouldn't be so superstitious. One rainy afternoon after school, after a particularly tough day where I had forgotten my lunch and had to go hungry, I pulled the ticket out. I stared at it, this small piece of paper that had brought nothing but trouble. Feeling a mix of anger and fear, I decided I had had enough. I grabbed my raincoat and boots and trudged out to the creek that ran behind our house. My heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest as the rain soaked through my hair. Standing at the creek's edge, I took one last look at the ticket before tearing it into tiny pieces and watching them get swept up by the current. It's just a piece of paper, I thought. Things started to look up after that. My friend found his baseball card and apologized to me, and we became friends again. I didn't miss the bus a single time that school year. My mom got a better job in the next couple of days. Whether it was all a coincidence or that ticket really was cursed, I couldn't say, but one thing was for sure, I learned to be more careful about what I picked up and brought home. I don't believe in the supernatural, even after all this stuff happened to me. My parents liked telling me that I imagined everything because I was so young. It's still hard to fully explain it, but I've long since accepted it as one of those weird coincidences that you just can't explain. I live in Burke County, North Carolina, in Morganton. I'm used to the quiet lifestyle that comes with living in a rural place. You get some weird characters here and there, but it's usually nothing too bad. I own a nice plot of land with my husband. My work schedule fluctuates. Sometimes I work days, sometimes I work nights. This happened on a night that I was on my way home after a night shift, so it had to be like 4 a.m. My phone was almost dead. I was hungry. I was tired, and I just wanted to get some food and head home. I stopped at the gas station to get $10 worth of gas and also a packaged sandwich, which I proceeded to eat inside the gas station cafe. Some sketchy guy was eyeing me for a little until he left the building without buying anything. After eating, I went outside to fill up the gas and then got back in the car. The smell of gas was extra pungent for some reason. These roads are very dark and twisty at night, so I was driving slow, especially since I was tired after a long day of work. Then something unexpected happened. The needle on the gas gauge suddenly dropped to E, and the low gas light came on and beeped. I had no idea what was going on. I'm not a car person and I'd never run out of gas before this. Plus, the needle just suddenly dropped. I thought at first that the computer was glitching, so I pulled over and restarted the car, but the needle was still on E. I tried to continue driving, but the engine died. I started having a panic attack. I called my husband first thing, and thank God he picked up. I asked him how did my car run out of gas after I just filled up, and as I got out of the car, I smelt gasoline. I told him this, and he said it sounds like I have a leak. He told me he'd head right over and he'd call our roadside assistance company. But then I heard a car coming with no headlights, and suddenly it stopped not far behind my car. I suddenly thought to bring up that sketchy guy who was watching me at the gas station and asked my husband if there was a chance he did something to my car. My husband's tone suddenly changed to sounding more concerned and worried. He said yes, there's a chance that he may have cut my fuel line. I didn't know what that meant. All I knew was I needed to run. I took my keys out of the ignition and shut the door and locked it so that the headlights would turn off. My phone was on like 2%, so I told him to text me when he's close. I ran off the road and towards the first house I could find. I ran down the long driveway and up the property to the front door. All the lights in the house were off. I still rang the bell multiple times anyway. Eventually, a light turned on and then the door opened. A man in his 60s opened the door. He looked like he was just woken up. I asked him to let me in to hide and charge my phone. After a bit of explaining, he opened the door fully and let me in. I asked him for an iPhone charger, and he said he'd go look for one, then asked me to take a seat in the living room. I sat down, still in my nurse scrubs, feeling a mix of emotions. The man called out from the kitchen asking me if I wanted some water. I said yes, please. Little did he know, I saw his reflection in a mirror in the living room that gave visibility into the kitchen. I saw him fill a cup with water, then I know for a fact I saw him drop something into the water. He walked out of view of the mirror, but the faucet was still running. It ran for a solid 30 more seconds before he turned it off. He came back into the living room with a glass of water and handed it to me. I thanked him, and he sat down and just looked at me, then asked me to explain the situation again. I replied to him, I just really need a charger so that I could contact my husband. He said all right and went upstairs. I checked my phone, and it was on 1%. I used that remaining battery to send my current location to my husband just in case. I then smelt the glass of water, and although it didn't smell like anything, I knew he put something in it. Now I had to make the decision of whether I should leave or not. On one hand, I needed to charge my phone badly. On the other, I was 99% sure he did something to this water. I heard him walking back down the stairs, and he said he doesn't have any iPhone chargers since he has an Android. After he said this, I got up and walked straight for the door. I'm not an idiot. Once outside, I ran back down the driveway to the road. I felt like throwing up. I couldn't believe two separate potential incidents from two different men happened in one night. I crept along the side of the road behind the trees. I took out my phone and sent my updated location, and right around now was when my battery died. I waited until I saw the familiar headlights of my husband's truck. I went out waving my arms, and thank God it was him. I got inside the truck and let all my emotions out, crying to him about what I just went through. He brought us to my car, and there was no longer a car behind mine. My back window was shattered, though, and it appeared someone had gotten into the back seat, but nothing of high value was left in my car to steal anyway. My car battery was also now dead. When I told my husband about the man who tried to potentially drug me, he was so furious he wanted to go break down his door. But I told him no, let's just wait for the tow truck to come. We waited quite a while before it came. My car was towed to my dealership, where they would take the car in the next day. My husband was right. My car was vandalized, and the fuel line was cut completely. Thank God I was off the next few days because I needed some time to mentally recover from this night. The idea that twice in one night I was almost a victim of some sketchy men, I just couldn't get over. Immersed between the pines, that was the predicament I currently ended up in, an empty highway spanning miles and miles through one of the most desolate roads in the Rocky Mountains. How long had it been since I was at Jim's diner, looking at the sky gray and foreboding, obvious that a storm was on the horizon. There was that smell in the air's sulfur, between the heat of the afternoon and the sudden chill. I could even feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. Trapped on this highway, with no exit for 40 miles, no car or truck for at least 2 hours, and my bike broken down. Wonderful, I muttered, exasperated. Could today get any worse? I had run out of gas. There were some farmlands a few miles back, lost to the oncoming darkness and surrounding sea of pines. The odd feeling, beyond the sense of being completely alone, was that of truly being alone. No chirp or buzz, even howling, that would animate these mountains, beyond the roar of tires and horns, like life itself had found residence elsewhere, leaving me in this impersonation of the world I once was in. Climbing up the hill, feeling the first drops of rain hitting my leather jacket, I felt the first tinge of fear. Until the end of the hill, I saw an exit, plain as day. The name of the town was Padua, the other name was scribbled out. Padua, I thought. Beggars can't be choosers. The walk didn't take as long as I expected it would. The cut into the pines led to a town trapped in another time. Not a ghost town from the last century with broken-down ranches and general stores, but a town that looked like a postcard from the 50s. That retro look was long associated with the big bop monster movies and drive-in theaters. There was only one problem with the site: not a single soul, nor a single car, was moving throughout the town. Instead, there was only the same silence I had heard throughout the mountain highway. There wasn't much more to think about. I resolved to explore the town as it started to come more into view with each step and push. There was a gas station not too far away, a diner down the block, and, from the looks of it, a hotel in the center between the two. I should name this town Lucky Break. Hello, I called out, standing at the gas station, my bike parked at a stall. No dust, the pumps were on but locked. Walking into the store, which was open, the lights flickered almost as a response. Anyone here? The store was completely packed full of food and drinks, just no worker. Maybe he's on break, I muttered to myself, trying not to dissect the logic any further. I grabbed a protein bar and a bottle of water. It was still cold and fresh to the touch. There was a feeling that I was being watched. Maybe it was just the eerie feeling of being alone. As the doors shut behind me, I could have sworn I saw a shadow sitting at the register. When I did a double take, I found the store completely empty. Drinking the water and chewing on the bar, it had been hours since I had eaten or drunk anything. I released the trigger to let the gas pump start. There wasn't any other way I knew how to get it to work, no credit card slot, no manual pump on the outside. Must be an older job. When I finished filling up the bike, I took in the scenery and watched the clouds. The bike came to life, and I looked around, still feeling that sense of not being alone. Oh well, I spoke aloud as I entered the empty street. I decided that, while it was only slightly drizzling, I might as well explore the town. Spanning only a few blocks, lights were on in most buildings, however, there wasn't a sign of a single human, animal, or even insect. Like a model or a set of a movie left alone, tomorrow they'd come back and start again. There were a few buildings I tried, I needed a bathroom anyway. A few cloth shops, nothing that I needed or wanted. Being on a bike limits what can be carried. Then there was a library, stacked with books. There was a theme I noticed, not thanks to the books but the periodicals. Nothing past the date of 1958. That didn't make sense. The last article read about the local football team going off to take the championship on October 21st. What happened October 22nd? There was too much to think about. The only thing that mattered was finding shelter and maybe getting a proper dinner. In all this commotion, I realized leaving the library that I still hadn't charged my phone. What was I thinking? Finding the diner I had passed before, the setup was one of those tube-like buildings that used to populate the country, slowly disappearing one by one to make way for franchises. Hello, I left my bike in the parking lot. The rain started to pick up, nothing hard yet, but it was coming soon. Again, I began to wonder why I would even ask. At this point, I'm just going to let myself in. I found a place for my phone to charge. The outlet looked a little weird, but it fit. When the screen came on, I could have guessed as much, no signal. Looking around the empty diner with its colorful booths, counter cakes in the displays, the grill in the back, even a jukebox and cigarette dispenser, I walked up, placing a few loose quarters in both. I found myself putting "Jingle, Jingle, Jingle" on the jukebox, a cigarette hanging out of my mouth. I checked the back room, the grills all worked and even the ovens. Playing with the switches, I found myself even dancing to antiquated songs, singing with a sparse knowledge of the lyrics. There was a fridge full of vegetables, red meat, even a steak. Putting the steak on, I heard "The End of the World" by Skeeter Davis starting to play. The eerie song almost put the sound of complete silence in perspective. I live in a pretty basic suburban town on Long Island, New York. My girlfriend Valerie and I recently started renting a small house, perfect for 2 to 4 people. We have a decent-sized backyard, and our house is on a very quiet street. One side of our house has a water drainage basin, as the county calls it, which is just a bunch of trees surrounding a sump. On the other side is our neighbor Neil, who lives with his wife. They're a bit older, in their 60s, and quiet. Then directly across the street is a little patch of woods that's in front of another water drainage basin. So for people who like privacy out front, our house is perfect. But then there's the backyard. Neil's house is blocked off by some bushes that the landlord planted years ago, so besides the house directly behind us over the fence, there are no other houses that could see into the yard. However, that one house looking into our backyard was all it took to genuinely make Valerie and I uncomfortable. As I'm writing this, it's currently the fall, so we've been doing fall cleanup the past few weeks in the front and backyard. I started noticing that any time we were out there, there were these two people standing at the upstairs window of the house behind us. It was a middle-aged man and woman. When I'd look up to that window, they'd keep looking and watching me. It got really uncomfortable to the point we pretended not to notice it, but we could only stomach doing this for so long. The leaves kept falling day by day, and the fall cleaning would need to continue. Valerie wouldn't want to be in the yard anymore because she was getting so creeped out at those two people who would watch us out the window without fail. So one foggy day while raking, I looked up at the window and once again, the two were standing at the big rectangular window. I decided to wave at them to see if they'd wave back. After a few seconds of smiling and waving, they didn't move. No reaction, but I could feel their stares and I could see their eyeballs looking at me. I turned away from the window and tried to continue raking, but after sneaking a peek back at the window a couple of minutes later and seeing them still there, I felt too awkward and weird being out there. I went inside. Valerie said we should go over and introduce ourselves. At first, I was hesitant about that, but I was persuaded to walk around the block with her to that house and ring the bell. We expected one of those people at the window to answer the door, but instead, the door cracked open just enough to see half of a person's head. It didn't look like either of those people who were always at the window. It was also super dark in the house to the point that it looked incredibly ominous and uncanny staring at half of that person's face. This guy looked a lot younger, like in his 22-year-old. Valerie and I tried to be friendly and introduce ourselves. The guy seemed very closed off though and not interested in speaking. He had a very, "what do you need" type of attitude about him. When I asked if he lives with anyone else here, like his parents, he said no. I mentioned the man and woman who were always at the window upstairs, and the guy on the other side of the door said he doesn't know who I'm talking about. Valerie and I felt really unsettled, so we just left. But weirdly, as we walked down the walkway back to the sidewalk, I noticed the guy behind the door was still peering half of his face through the cracked open door. I'm sure he watched us walk away until we were out of sight. That interaction was weirder and creepier than we were expecting. When we got back home, I went upstairs to our room. The upstairs of our house is only our master bedroom and the bathroom. It has two windows. One of the windows looks over to that house over the fence. I looked out the window to see those two people looking out the window again, and even at this distance, I felt like they were staring right at me. I shut the blinds and went down to tell Valerie. We agreed it was time to plant some arborvitaes to block their window from view. The only problem is it's already the fall, and it's too late to plant any kind of trees. We have to make it through winter. After a few days of not looking outside the bedroom window or going into the backyard, one night we heard a strange knocking sound from downstairs. I told Valerie to wait in bed while I went downstairs. The knocking got louder, and I quickly discovered it wasn't the sound of knocking on one of the doors, but rather on the glass of one of the backyard windows. The blinds of it were, of course, shut because we didn't want those creepy people looking into our living room at night. I approached it, and yes, it was 100% a fist knocking on the glass. I considered saying, "Who's there?" but I froze, and I was too scared. Instead, I flicked on the backyard light, and then the knocking stopped. I didn't even want to look out the window or door. I kept the light on and then went back upstairs to my room where I told Valerie about the creepy knocking. But I claimed that I chased whoever it was away. I exaggerated in fear of sounding like a coward. I also didn't want her to worry. We both imagined it to have been something to do with that house though. Nothing has happened since, but I'll have to update throughout the winter. Update, it's been 2 weeks, and we haven't seen those people at the window ever since. But last night, we heard yelling and screaming from that house. I had to open our window, and it became clear there were muffled yells coming from that house. The fact that we heard it through 2 sets of closed windows just goes to show how loud the yelling was. Then, out of nowhere, it just stopped and went quiet. We almost called the police, but ultimately didn't. I'll update again if anything else happens, but we're really getting creeped out here now. There's a nice quiet scenic creek not far from my house. I like to drive my kayak up to it every once in a while on the weekends in the summer. This one particular weekend was one of those weekends. The weather was perfect, sunny and 70s. I'd kayaked down this creek a bunch of times and never had I seen anyone else kayaking it. That's part of the reason I like it, because I'm a very reserved person and I like to do things myself, preferably with privacy. So, I set out on the kayak not far from where I parked my car, which is in a gravelly dirt parking area right off the road. There was one other car that pulled in a few minutes after I did, which was unusual. I'd never seen any other cars except my own here. 20 minutes into my kayaking, someone came out from the woods ahead of me, coming up on the left, and approached the edge of the water. He stopped and waved at me and smiled. He put his hands on his hips and greeted me. It seemed he had an expectation for me to stop and chat. I instantly knew I didn't like his smile, but my mother raised me to be polite to everybody, so I stopped paddling and smiled and greeted him back. There was an awkward pause where he was just nodding his head with his closed-lipped smile, and I had to break the silence by saying, "It's a beautiful day out." He nodded his head and said, "Yup," then asked where I'm from. I made something up and said, "From up north, just visiting." He clearly lacked the ability to hold any sort of conversation, and that's coming from me. I'm not the most social person myself. So, I wanted to just move along. I told him to have a great rest of his day and continued onward down the river. Never in a million years was I expecting what happened next to happen. I turned when I heard a snap of a stick or something from not far behind me. There, in the not-so-far distance, was the guy hiding behind a couple of trees, seemingly following me. I was disturbed and uncomfortable, like he was clearly trying to not be seen. I was scared to call him out in fear of how he might respond, so I pretended not to notice him and continued to kayak down. I would continue to side glance every so often to see if he was still following me, and he was. I had never wanted to see someone else in the water so much in my life. I took out my phone to try to call my dad or my brother for help, but of course, I had no cell reception out there. Still, instead of being followed and probably attacked, I decided to stop in my place, turn around, and threaten to call the police if he didn't stop following me. The man just stood in place behind another big tree, though he was clear as day there. I then decided to fake call the cops. I raised my phone in the air at the man and said, "I see you there, I'm calling them now." I then proceeded to fake a phone call, pretending like I'm talking to the police. The man started to walk away deeper into the woods. It seemed to have worked. I turned around immediately and started kayaking back up the way I came as fast as I possibly could. I would constantly look over my shoulders until I got back to where I launched the kayak. I made it safely. I checked my whole surroundings before stepping out of the water and carrying my kayak back to my car. The other car in the little parking area was still there, but I made a disturbing discovery that may have saved my life. Up until this point, everything that happened could have maybe been explained away. However, I noticed broken glass near the back of my car, and the back passenger side window wasn't there anymore. It had been shattered. I didn't step 1 foot closer to my car. I stayed hidden in the woods and checked if I had bars now that I was closer to the road. I did, and I called 911 successfully. I reported the whole incident and the broken window, and I stated I was scared I was still being followed. Waiting for the police to arrive felt like the longest, most tense moment of my life. It dragged on far too long, but when they pulled into the dirt area, I finally came out from the woods and waved at them. I pointed to the car, and 2 police officers came out and approached the car, where they found him, the man from the woods, waiting in the back seat of my car, hiding and waiting for me to enter my car to grab me. It was beyond satisfying to see him arrested. He definitely wasn't smiling anymore. I looked at him as it almost seemed like he was avoiding looking at me as he was taken to the police car. I'm happy the man was so stupid that he thought I wouldn't notice shattered glass all over the side of my car. When I was 18, my friend Dash, who was a big goofball, came over to chill in our basement as he often would during the summer. I remember he had a Coke bottle in his hand, and I was eating Wendy's when he said we should check out that creepy little cemetery across town. It was the most random idea ever, and I even told him that. Still, we had no school the next day, and I knew exactly which cemetery he was talking about. I don't know if one should even call it a regular cemetery. It's just a small plot of land with maybe 100 tombstones at most. The tombstones were very archaic looking, and any time we'd pass, there would be no signs of anyone having come to visit within the last decade. The site probably dated back centuries and had this super creepy vibe to it because it was closed off by a Gothic metal fence and surrounded by woods on 2 sides, the road on one, and some old abandoned building on the other. Everything about it just gave scary vibes. It took a little persuading, but Dash managed to get me to want to check it out too. Ironically, it was a very cloudy, reddish kind of day, conveniently adding to the mood. Dash pulled up his Honda to the side of the road. I told him to pull up more so it wasn't obvious. This was a low-traffic road, so it would look kind of suspicious. He pulled up a few hundred feet down the road, and we got out and cut through the woods so that any potential passing traffic wouldn't see us entering the little cemetery. Hopping the fence in the woods was easy. It was maybe a 3 or 4 foot fence. Dash kind of took the lead on this since it was mainly his venture. He led us through the eerie little plot of land, and we looked at the archaic tombstones. They all seemed to be from the 19th century. The writing on some of them was illegible at that point. I know it sounds super dumb and cliché, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched constantly. I started looking around the surrounding woods. I told Dash how creepy this was. "I know," he replied. Still with the feeling of being watched, I looked at the abandoned building next to the cemetery, at one of the windows. For a brief moment, I knew I saw someone standing at the window, even through the fog, smudge, and dirt on the glass. But they casually either ducked or walked away from the window. I told Dash we were being watched by someone in that building, and he turned to look at it as well. Then he went to look for the entrance to it. I told him, "Don't." I said we should just leave before we get in trouble. I stayed still by the tombstone he was looking at while he walked around a building, and then he found a way in. He called me over, but I stayed put. I heard some loud kind of crack, so I looked in that direction, and there was this older man, probably around 55. Gray hair, had on a black raincoat, I believe he was wearing jeans, and he had a mustache, but that's all I really got of him. Then he opened his mouth and screamed. Not just yelled, he screamed, "Get out." He screamed it so loud I thought I saw birds fly away from being startled. Just like that, I started to feel lightheaded, and suddenly everything went dark. The next thing I remember was waking up to being dragged in the woods. I freaked out, thinking I was being kidnapped, but when I turned and got up, I saw it was just Dash. Dash was freaking out about something. He told me to follow him and run back to the car, so I didn't ask questions. As we ran through the woods, I heard something close behind me, and when I turned, I realized we were being followed by someone. So I ran even faster. We got to his Honda, and he basically put it in drive before the car even had a chance to fully start. When Dash was inside that abandoned building, he found a sigil of Baphomet painted on the wood floor, which is basically the sign of Satan. Around it were a bunch of freaky dolls with buttons for eyes. He didn't get to see anything else in the building because he heard the old man scream at me outside. He came running to find me passed out on the floor, and he saw the old man slowly walking over to me. He started to drag me away from the old man and into the woods. He actually literally picked me up and threw me over the fence to get me out. I quickly came back to consciousness, and that's when we ran. I had only fainted one time in my life, and it was at that moment. I don't know why I fainted, but it happening at a graveyard with some kind of satanic ritual building right next to it makes it that much stranger. I'll never forget when I worked nighttime security at a cemetery for about 2 weeks. It was never something I wanted to do as a security guard, but I didn't have a choice. The agency I worked for forced me to transfer due to an incident where I allegedly assaulted a kid who happened to have rich parents while doing my job. I'm not allowed to talk about that case, though, so I won't. I didn't want to work at a cemetery for obvious reasons. Unfortunately, my boss told me to accept the transfer or resign from the agency, and I wasn't ready to be out of a job. The cemetery in question was the oldest in the city, and it was considered historic. However, it had just signed a contract for nighttime security after a couple of grave robberies that had recently occurred. It only happened twice in recent history, but in the span of a couple of weeks, which indicated that it might happen again. Aside from the daytime toll with workers, I was the first security guard to work there, which meant I had nobody before me to tell me how things might go. I couldn't instill the first night, so I made a lot of walkabouts to the burial grounds in an effort to desensitize myself from how damn spooky it was in the dark. It had the opposite effect, though. At one point, I came across one of the graves that had been robbed. It was already refilled, although the grass hadn't been recovered yet. The marker was eroded, but I could tell that it was a woman who had lived to be pretty old. I paid my respects and I walked on without thinking much of it. Over the course of a few nights, nothing happened. It was one of the more boring starts to a job that I've had. I was used to getting off work around 4 or 5 a.m. at the latest, but I was in the graveyard from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., 3 nights a week, and that schedule didn't suit me. I became extremely drowsy halfway through each shift, and the coffee available in the booth was like water to me. When I went back for my second round of shifts, I was already over it. There was nobody around to notice, though, so I didn't care. I was through with my first week, so I figured my supervisors would be more relaxed about watching over the camera footage. Instead of trying to force myself to stay awake when I was exhausted and nothing was happening, I let myself sleep when I felt like it. I didn't think the grave robbers would actually come back and try their luck for a third time once they knew I was there, and it's not like I had a problem stealing company time from the agency that screwed me over. However, there was one party who had a problem with me sleeping on the job. The last night I worked there, I was exhausted from the previous shifts, and it didn't take too long for me to start dozing off in my chair. I actually fell into a deep enough sleep to start dreaming. I don't remember how the dream started, but I know that at some point it suddenly became a nightmare. I'd laid down thinking I was about to get a massage or something, only to feel immense pain in my stomach. I screamed and opened my eyes to see an elderly woman standing above me with a shovel, plunging it into my abdomen and digging out my insides. I couldn't move, and all I could do was watch her eviscerate me. It was the most vivid dream that I've ever had. Luckily, I was able to force myself awake. I opened my eyes with a start. Then, right there on the other side of the booth window, I saw that same decrepit old woman staring right at me. I jumped back and fell off the chair, losing sight of her for a second. When I got to my feet, she was gone, but I was thoroughly shaken. I was terrified by the thought of going out there, but I knew it was my job to go looking for anyone who attempted to trespass. To be honest, I didn't feel any safer being a sitting duck in the toll booth. I stepped outside into the cold under a full moon and turned on my flashlight, throwing the beam in every direction. At first, I didn't see anyone, but then my heart skipped a beat when I saw a figure standing near the back of the property by the trees. I shouted at them, but they didn't respond. I had to look away for a second as I heard rustling in the bushes behind me, but it was thankfully just a possum that I startled into running off. That was logical and reassuring, although there was still that mysterious figure standing by the woods. But, of course, when I looked back, she was gone. I couldn't understand how such a frail old woman was covering so much ground, but I marched over to where I last saw her without thinking about it. I had to walk across the entire graveyard to get to the back of the property. Along the way, it seemed like every single creature in the woods was going insane. I heard flocks of birds suddenly take flight from all the trees at once. An owl let out one of those awful screeches that they make. Even a pack of coyotes started to go haywire in the distance. I felt like all the forces in nature were warning me not to keep going, but in my gut, I was worried that if I stopped walking, something else would happen. So I pressed on until I finally got to the edge of the graveyard. I looked around with a flashlight and called out to the person I saw, but I didn't see or hear anyone. Then, as quickly as it all had started, all the noises in the woods stopped. Every single animal fell silent, even the bugs went quiet. I muttered to myself in confusion and started to turn around. But that's when I noticed I was standing right on top of one of the graves that had been robbed, the one of the old woman that I'd seen the week before. As soon as I realized this, I felt stiff hands wrap around my throat and my feet were kicked out from under me. I couldn't see who was doing this to me, but they were strong as hell. They bashed my face into the recently replaced dirt probably a dozen times until it started to feel like I was about to pass out from lack of oxygen. Then, at the last second, it stopped. I felt the rough touch of the hand simply disappear. I quickly got to my feet in a panic, but I couldn't see anyone in the area. It was like I'd imagined the whole thing, but there was no way that I could have. It felt as real as anything else. Whatever it was had me chilled to the bone. I didn't finish my shift that night. I ran to my car with my tail between my legs and quit the job on the spot. This event has haunted me ever since. I've pieced together what it meant over the years. The spirit of the old woman who was robbed didn't take kindly to me slacking on the job, and she took matters into her own hands to make sure it never happened again. I've never been a superstitious person, but sometimes things happen in life that make you reevaluate your assumptions. Even now, when I'm at work and I feel myself getting the urge to slack off, I see that woman out of the corner of my eye for a split second, reminding me of the lesson she taught me. I first heard this story when I was in college. I'd come home for winter break, and I remember it was just me and my dad in the house. I was watching some kind of ghost hunter program on TV just for laughs. I don't really believe in that stuff, though when you watch the programs on TV, they're just so obviously fake. It's too hard for me to let go of my preconceptions and just watch and try to get into it. My dad was the same way, so I thought. He didn't seem interested in the paranormal or anything. He was kind of the guy who would scoff at anything supernatural. The program I was watching flipped to a commercial, and I casually got up and found my dad in the kitchen. Kind of out of the blue, I asked him, "Hey Dad, do you believe in ghosts?" His reply was so casual it shocked me. "Really?" I asked, a bit taken aback. "It just doesn't seem like you." He shrugged his shoulders and mulled over what I had just said. "Yeah," he replied, "eventually, but I know ghosts are real. I've met one." Upon hearing this statement, I had to know the story. You see, my dad is like me, he likes to tell stories. I could retell most of his stories from memory. Just because he would tell them so frequently to anyone who would listen, yet here was a story I had never heard of. An event that changed my dad's life. To this day, I don't even know if I believe it or not, but when someone who is so influential on your life, someone who seems so logical and so down to earth, tells you something like this, he calls into question what you believe and why. Though he never brings it up, when I talk to him about it, he swears it's completely true, no exaggeration and no doubt in his mind about what happened. So here it is, from his point of view. I was back in the house in Tacoma where you grew up until you were about 4. My parents still lived in the house, but I was going to college. I was back visiting them for a weekend. I was just over at Tacoma Community College, so it wasn't far away. I came back often to visit and get a home-cooked meal. I remember that I was sitting down for dinner with my parents, just the 3 of us. It was in the late spring, early summer season, so it hadn't really gotten dark yet. We were talking like normal when the phone rang in the kitchen. My mom got up and answered the phone, leaving my dad and me in the other room together alone. After a short while, she called my dad into the kitchen as well. "Leo, can you come here for a moment?" I remember that she seemed worried, her voice was kind of shaking a bit. My dad wiped his face, got up, and joined my mom in the kitchen. They weren't in there for long, but they were talking quietly, and it felt strange. After a few moments, they finally came out of the kitchen. They had their coats on now. "Something's come up, and we have to go out for a bit," my mom said. "There's dessert in the fridge. Help yourself. Don't worry about the dishes, I'll wash them when we get back." My dad said nothing, but I could tell from his face that it was serious. My mom looked genuinely worried. They were out that door in a flash, and I was left to finish my dinner at the table. I cleared the table and washed my plate despite my mom's instructions, and I went into the main room to read. I sat down on the sofa, opened one of my school books, and began to relax. Hours went by, and my parents still hadn't come back. It was now around 11 o'clock, and I was just about to get ready for bed. I walked up the stairs, making my way to the bathroom when I heard a strange noise. I paused and listened for a while. It was the ceiling. The ceiling was making a slow, drawn-out whining noise. The wood was creaking gently. It wasn't an unusual sound, but there was an unusual rhythm to it that made me uncomfortable and curious. After listening for a while, I pulled down the steps to the attic and listened a bit more. I could hear the sound more clearly now, along with a metallic creaking noise. I gathered up my courage and decided to investigate. I climbed the steps. Now, I have to say, I wasn't scared. I didn't have an uneasy feeling, actually, to the contrary. I felt quite comfortable. Even though it was dark and eerie, the energy in the room wasn't foreign. It almost felt warm and inviting. As I looked around the attic, it quickly became obvious where the sound was coming from. Among the boxes and various other storage was an old rocking chair that belonged to my grandmother. It was one of many possessions that she had left with us at the house. She was in a nearby home for the elderly and couldn't fit much of her belongings in her room. The rocking chair was gently rocking back and forth, causing the floorboards to creak beneath it. Next to the chair, an old bird cage was displaying similar behavior. The cage door was gently swinging open and closed, making a quiet metallic creak. I figured there was a draft, and knowing that the sounds would keep me up all night if I didn't put an end to it, I set out in search of the source. I combed the corners of the room, but try as I might, I couldn't find the source of the draft, nor could I feel it myself. There were no windows, and there wasn't much ventilation. It wasn't even windy outside, it was a calm evening. Furthermore, the chair was heavy, as was the birdcage. Yet, there were other things nearby that weren't disturbed, stacks of paper and the like. After a while, I gave up and looked back to the chair. It was still gently rocking. I walked over to it and rested my hand on the armrest. The chair stopped rocking. Still, I couldn't feel any kind of draft. I lifted my hand, and the chair was calm and quiet. But as I turned away, I heard the creaking again. I turned back, and the chair was still rocking. It was really strange, but as I had said before, I wasn't really that creeped out yet. I shrugged it off and walked over to the birdcage. The door was still swinging open and closed. The cage had once housed a parrot belonging to my grandmother, but it had been empty for some time. I latched the cage shut, figuring I could at least stop this one sound. I made for the steps, but just as I was about halfway down, I heard the metallic creaking again. I looked behind me, and the cage door was back to swinging open, unlatched, right alongside the chair, which continued rocking as before. Something had caused it to unlatch. I was sure that I had latched it properly. In any other circumstance, I would have been scared out of my mind, but for whatever reason, I wasn't. I just didn't feel uneasy. A rocking chair and a bird cage aren't really the harbingers of doom anyway. I descended from the attic with a last glance at the strange behavior and went about my bedtime routine. The creaking continued for a while, and I couldn't sleep for it. I went back upstairs and made another attempt to find the source. I went back downstairs to where I couldn't hear the noise, and I continued reading. It was a little after midnight when I heard my parents pull into the driveway. They came in and found me reading, and they sat down with me. My mom was crying. They explained to me that they had spent the evening at the hospital where my grandmother had just passed away. That's the story as my dad tells it. He believes to this day that before she left this world, his grandmother came home to pay him one last visit. At the time of this story, I brushed it off, but it sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. Up until about a year ago, I worked at a grocery chain. I was, and still am, a working college student. My availability was only 6 p.m. to closing, which in this case was midnight. It wasn't my favorite job. I dealt with a lot of annoying customers and coworkers, one of whom once broke into my locker and put a used tampon in the pocket of my apron, but that's a whole different story. My job was walking distance from where I lived, which made it really convenient since I didn't have a car. One Friday night, I was closing as usual with my supervisor, and we were running later than we usually did. My supervisor and I finally got the remaining customers out of the store, clocked out, and left. I left before my supervisor and began walking home. After a long, frustrating day of annoying customers, it felt great to just walk through the fresh winter air. I spent a few minutes shuffling through my phone's playlist to find a song to walk home to. I had made my way down the main road, careful not to slip on any of the ice. One thing that's really important to know about me is that I'm a very anxious person, and while it's definitely a problem most of the time, it does help make me constantly aware of my surroundings. That's when I saw an approaching car slowing down on the deserted main road, and I automatically went on high alert. It was a black car that came to a slow stop against the sidewalk I was on, about 10 feet behind me. I immediately clutched my phone in my hand and brought it out of my pocket. If there wasn't any ice covering the sidewalk and my feet didn't hurt, I probably would have run. Instead, I opted to try and pretend that I wasn't afraid, which I don't think worked because I picked up my pace after the car stopped. It was then that I heard a man's voice call out to me. "Hey, it's cold out here. You want a ride?" the man said. I kept walking away from him up the street, pretending I didn't hear him and just hoping he would go away. It didn't work. A few moments later, I heard the car tires crushing the ice on the road and then turned around to see what he was doing. He was now driving with the car in reverse. When he caught up to me, he had rolled down the passenger seat window some more. He was a black man, maybe in his mid to late 30s. He looked at me and I stopped, prompting him to stop his car as well. "Hey, let me give you a ride," he said through the car window. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to be polite because even though I was scared, I tried to be rational. All he did was offer a girl a ride home who was walking in the cold at night. Also, with the possibility of him being a kidnapper or a rapist, it was really best not to piss him off on the empty street. "No thank you," I said politely but firmly that I hesitated for a second. I was trying to figure out what to say that would get him to leave me alone away which street I lived on. "I'm okay," I insisted. "Thanks, though." As I finished thanking him, I started walking again, now putting both headphones in with the song paused. It was more of a way to signal that I was done talking to him. He didn't say anything, but I knew that he was watching me walk away. I felt relieved when I got a few more feet away from his car and heard the sound of his tires driving away. Unfortunately, the situation was only getting worse. As I started walking past the entrance of a car dealership, I saw the same car making a U-turn in the middle of the street out of the corner of my eye. When I turned slightly, he pulled up to the sidewalk yet again, this time a few feet in front of me. The man then opened the driver's seat door and got out of the car. It was at that point I was actually afraid I wouldn't make it home that night. He looked at me with this weird expression on his face. He had this really focused look while trying to look casual. It's really hard to describe. He started walking up to me. This kind of situation had never happened to me before, but I always thought of dangerous hypothetical situations in my head. I guess thinking about those situations prepared me to an extent because before I even realized it, my phone was already against my ear like I was on the phone with someone, even though I wasn't. When he came closer to me, he saw my phone in my hand and must have realized someone could know where I am right now, or I could be calling 911. That's the only explanation I can think of, because when he looked at my phone, his demeanor totally changed. He stopped in his tracks with a worried look on his face and then asked me, "Oh, are you on the phone with someone right now?" I replied, looking at him with my phone still against my face and my other hand casually in my pocket. Without saying anything else, the man immediately turned around, got back in his car, and then started to drive up the street. I walked slowly at first, letting some distance grow between us, but as soon as I felt safer, I walked up the street as fast as I could without slipping. I frantically tried to call my dad, who I thought was home at the time. He didn't pick up. I then tried to call my sister and my fiancé. I didn't feel like I was in danger anymore, but my adrenaline was through the roof and I wanted to hear from someone who would make me feel better. I gave up calling after I couldn't get in touch with anyone and just kept walking. I was finally getting ready to turn onto another street when I passed an empty parking lot and saw the same man leaning against his car looking over at me. "Hey," was all he said in a flat tone when I walked by. At this point, I was completely freaked out. I didn't have my phone out anymore, so I couldn't pretend I was talking to someone again, and I was also significantly closer to my house. If he decided to get into his car and follow me, there wasn't any detour I could take to try and lose him. I was now on the verge of tears, and that's when I decided to call 911. I called 911 and told them the situation. The officer on the other line stayed on the phone with me until I got into my house. After that, an officer came to my house and asked me a bunch of questions about the man. He also asked me about his car and where I last saw him. All of the details were either too vague or I didn't remember. He said that he would at least patrol the area for him. I'm not really sure if he actually did or not, but it made me feel better at the time. From that point, I needed a ride to and from work every shift until I got my schedule changed to day shifts. Just a few weeks later, the college semester ended and I was planning on skipping a semester anyway. That experience only reinforced my decision. The more I think about that situation, the more I realize how lucky I was. I was in the perfect position to be taken, but I actually used some quick thinking that really de-escalated the situation. I moved in with my fiancé, and now I have a pocket knife and pepper spray for whenever I walk home at night from my new job. It's something to remember. If you haven't called 911, if you don't have anything to defend yourself against someone, either let someone know where you are or pretend that they know where you are. It can potentially save your life. When I was just 9, we moved to a new house in a different town. I was entering a new elementary school as a 5th grader, which is always tough starting out. It was a bit awkward, as all the kids already knew each other, and I was just some random kid entering the scene. In my elementary school, you were made to sit with the kids from your class during lunch. I remember it being really awkward the first few days. Kids are extremely judgmental around that age, and I was judged as the new kid, making it more difficult to make new friends. But during those initial days of being the new kid on the block, I actually met a few of the kids on the block. One of the kids was Roy, who went to a private school, so we went to different schools. We met while I was biking down the street, and he asked if I had just moved into the house on the corner. We started hanging out from there. Then, a few days later, I met Hank. Hank actually rang the bell one day and asked my parents for me. I was confused when my parents called me to the door and introduced me to him. He said he lived down the block and wanted to know if I liked video games. Of course, I said yes, and he invited me over to his house to play Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. I didn't have that game but really wanted it, so I said yes. We walked to his house, which was literally the corner house at the opposite end of the block. Right away, I felt like the house looked less nice than every other house on the block. It was the same size as most, but it just looked run down and not taken care of. There was no grass. The front yard was just two big patches of dirt with a walkway cutting through them to the front door. We entered the house, and it was equally disheveled inside. It was like a house of hoarders, with boxes and junk everywhere in every room. He led us to the basement, which smelled like 15 cats lived down there. Weirdly enough, there didn't seem to be any pets. The basement was a pigsty. It may have been the messiest room in the house. We sat on this brown leather couch placed right in front of the TV. He had a GameCube and PS2. He booted up San Andreas, and we played the two-player mode. It was actually fun, and in that moment, I thought I was going to like Hank and would want to be friends with him. Eventually, I wanted to go home, so I said I had to go. He seemed really disappointed, like he wanted to keep hanging out. We'd already been playing for like 2 hours, so I just wanted to go home. He followed me halfway home until I said, "See you later," basically saying in a friendly way, "All right, go away now." That was the first warning sign. I remember this kid Hank who lived down the block from me. One day, he rang my doorbell and asked if I could come out and play. I recall thinking he was a bit of a weirdo, but I didn't find it concerning just yet. The next day, Hank rang the doorbell again and asked my parents if I could come play. This time, we played GameCube in my room for about an hour. To be honest, I was starting to not really like him. I felt like he was weird and made me uncomfortable with how physically close he got to me. The next day after school, he rang the bell again. I wasn't really in the mood, so I told my mom to tell him I didn't feel good. He left, and I was relieved. I would rather hang out with my friend Roy, honestly, because I just liked him more. That same day, I rode my bike up to Roy's house to see if he could hang out. He was down, so we started riding our bikes further up the block. This was a mistake because as we passed Hank's house, he came outside onto his front stoop as if he were waiting by the window. It was weird, and it was also awkward because I had just had my mom tell him I was sick before. As we passed, I told Roy that I had hung out with that kid and that I felt like he was slightly weird. Roy was shocked that I had hung out with him, saying that whole family was crazy. I found out from Roy that Hank was actually a couple of years older than me. He was 12. From this point on, I decided to steer clear of him. The next weekend, Hank came to our door again, asking for me. I had told my mom before this already to tell him I'm not home if he came back, so she did that. But late that night, I woke up to my window completely open and a cool breeze blowing into the room. It was a chilly September night, so I most definitely left the window closed originally. Waking up to an unexpected breeze made me question who could have done that. Then I felt something poke my foot, and I screamed. I looked at the foot of my bed and saw Hank. He told me to be quiet, it's just him. Before I could even ask what he was doing in my room, he explained that his parents were fighting and he wanted to sleep with me. He climbed through my window. I was in shock. I told him to get out, and he pleaded with me to let him sleep in bed with me. Again, I told him to get out. Watching him turn and climb out of my window was a disturbing scene. I closed the window and locked it, and then went straight to my parents to wake them up and tell them. They couldn't believe it. The next day, my parents both went down the block to talk to Hank's parents, and when they came back, they said it didn't go well. Hank's crazy mom screamed and laughed in my parents' faces, taking no accountability for her son's actions. I'm sure my parents didn't want to get police involved because Hank was just a kid. But however many nights later, I woke up to knocks at my window. I had my blinds closed, but I knew for a fact it was Hank. I didn't answer the knocks, which went on and on for like 5 minutes. I even heard an attempt at opening the window. I was actually scared. I remember my heart racing. Eventually, the knock stopped. I went to tell my parents, and they told me to just ignore it. I think they weren't as threatened because, like I said before, Hank was just a kid. It was probably a few days later when Roy and I, along with another kid I made friends with from school, were biking from my house down the block, and when we passed Hank's house, I saw him run to the window as we passed. He just watched. I told my friends about what happened, and they found it hilarious. One of my friends made a comment about how he sounds like someone who would live in a gross house like that. That night, for the final time, I woke up to a sound in my room. It was the sound of my window being shattered. I screamed as I saw Hank climbing through the window through the closed blinds. I ran to my parents' room and woke them up. By this point, Hank was already back outside. My dad went outside and chased him all the way back to his house, with Hank making it back inside before my dad could catch up to him. My dad pounded on the door until Hank's parents opened up, and my dad must have said something right because he somehow managed to convince Hank's parents to pay for the window if he didn't involve the police. They ended up paying whatever it cost to fix the window, and I never heard from Hank again. Though I did see him once or twice in front of his house the next couple of years while in the car passing his house. That family eventually ended up moving somewhere else, thankfully. I think there's a chance Hank was looking to do something crazy, like murder me or at the very least attack me, just because he saw me hanging with other kids when I didn't want to be his friend. I mean, what else would he do after shattering my window with something and climbing inside? I'm scared to wonder what kind of person Hank grew up to be. In the quiet town of Briarwood, nestled among the rolling hills, there stood an ancient willow tree. Its sprawling branches reached towards the sky like gnarled fingers, casting eerie shadows over the neighborhood playground. Children were warned to stay away from the tree, for it was said to be cursed. But for Audrey and her friends, curiosity overcame fear. Audrey was 7 years old when she first heard about the legend of the Whispering Willow. It was whispered among the kids at school, a tale passed down from older siblings and cousins. They said that if you stood beneath the tree at midnight and listened closely, you could hear the whispers of lost souls trapped within its ancient roots. One fateful summer evening, Audrey and her two best friends, Imelda and Patrick, decided to test the legend. Armed with flashlights and nervous laughter, they made their way to the playground where the willow stood sentinel in the moonlight. The air was thick with humidity as they approached the tree, its twisted branches swaying gently in the breeze. Audrey's heart raced in her chest as they huddled together beneath the willow's canopy. The playground was deserted, the only sounds the distant chirping of crickets. "Are you sure about this?" Imelda whispered, her voice trembling. Audrey nodded, her palms sweaty against the flashlight. "We have to do it together. On the count of 3. They took a deep breath, their anticipation palpable in the air. 1, 2, 3, Patrick exclaimed, and they switched off their flashlights, plunging themselves into darkness. For a moment, all was silent. Audrey strained her ears, hoping to catch a whisper, a murmur from the depths of the tree. Then, just as doubt began to creep in, she heard it, a soft, haunting whisper, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of her heart, but as she listened, it grew louder, more insistent. "Help me, help me." The voice was plaintive, full of sorrow and despair. Audrey's blood ran cold as the words echoed in her mind. She could feel Imelda and Patrick tense beside her, their breaths shallow and ragged. The darkness seemed to press in around them, suffocating and oppressive. "We have to get out of here," Imelda whimpered, her voice barely above a whisper. But before they could move, something shifted in the shadows. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form indistinct and ghostly. It floated towards them, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Audrey's scream pierced the night as the figure reached out a translucent hand, its fingers curling towards her. She stumbled backward, tripping over a gnarled root and falling hard on the ground. "Run," Patrick shouted, grabbing Audrey's hand and pulling her to her feet. They sprinted towards the playground's exit, their hearts pounding in their chests. Behind them, the figure gave chase, its eerie whispers growing louder and more urgent. "Help me. Don't leave me." They burst out of the playground, gasping for breath as they stumbled onto the quiet street. The figure was gone, but the echoes of its voice lingered in their minds. They never spoke of that night again, each too terrified to confront the reality of what they had experienced. The Whispering Willow remained a forbidden place, a dark reminder of the unknown terrors that lurked in the shadows. Years passed, and Audrey grew into a young woman, the memory of that night fading like a distant dream. But one summer evening, as she walked past the playground on her way home, she heard it, a soft, haunting whisper carried on the breeze. "Help me." Audrey's blood turned to ice as she glanced towards the willow tree, its branches reaching towards the darkening sky. In that moment, she knew that some legends were born of truth, and that the Whispering Willow held secrets that were best left undisturbed. I come from a small town in Pennsylvania, and I've lived here all of my life. I'm 17 years old, and the time this story took place, I was around 14 years old. My memory around this is a little hazy because I don't like to talk about it, but I figured I'd let out any dark feelings I still get by it. It may not be considered a scary story, but to me, this was probably one of the most scariest things that I've ever been through. At the time this happened, I was an 8th grader in middle school. During the time, my mom worked at Panera Bread, and she had to work very early in the morning, so me and my sister would usually take the bus to school while my dad and my little brother, who was around 4 years old at the time, would stay home. This will be important later. It was like any other ordinary day. Me and my sister would get ready and leave it around 7:20 a.m. to walk to our bus stop. We lived in an apartment complex, and we would have to walk the 3 minutes to the front of the apartment because that's where the bus would pick us up. A little background information: me and my sister would meet up with our friends at the bus stop since we lived in the same apartment complex, and we would wait until the bus showed up. I would stay at the back with my friend, while my sister and her friend would be towards the front, 5 feet from the stop. So, like our usual routine, I had met up with my friend, Reed, and my sister would meet up with her friend, who I'll call Lelia. We waited for the bus to show up. Me and Reed would always see this boy, who I'll refer to as Scott. He was a year younger than us, and he would always run across the street to our bus stop to get a seat since we would be the first to be picked up. This was because by the time the bus driver would pick him up, he'd be the last person, and there would be no seats left for him to sit at. So he began to run across the street, and we were used to seeing him run across like that. Reed and I would always laugh at the way he ran, but wouldn't pay any more attention after he made it across. this will also be important. So, as we're waiting for the bus to arrive, me and my friend were talking, and there would be 5 other kids waiting for the bus at the front of the apartments as well. And like always, we see Scott across the street, waiting for the bus to arrive. A few minutes go by, and we see the yellow bus coming towards our stop. So everyone on our side begins to gather their belongings, and we begin to form a line as the bus gets closer. It begins to blink its lights, and the stop sign starts to come out at the side, as a sign for the other cars to stop. And for just a second, I begin to see Scott running across. I don't give it 2 thoughts since this was normal, and I began to hear the screeching noise coming from the opposite side of the road. It was like everything was going in slow motion during those couple of seconds, and I remember hearing the screeching noise become louder and louder. As I'm picking up my head to see what the noise was, I heard a big thump noise, and what I saw next will forever remain in my mind until this day. I hear a big thump noise, and I then see Scott flying in the air. I then see Scott hitting the ground so hard, and the noise was so loud as he then made an impact to the street. I remember hearing my friend Reed then scream at the top of her lungs, and I then quickly looked at the car, and I saw the driver inside. I remember seeing the bus driver quickly taking out his walkie-talkie attached to his radio as he was then saying all these codes into it. I then see Scott running around the bus and towards where our bus stop was, and he then had his arms wrapped around his stomach, and he was bleeding all around his head. He also had these cuts on his face, and he was crying wildly. During that moment, I was so horrified that I froze, and I was so scared to say anything. The driver then came out of the car and began to panic, then saying to Scott, "Oh my God, man, I'm so sorry. I never even saw you." I was looking down for 1 second, and then it just happened. But Scott was in so much pain, then he didn't even pay attention to him. Then this kid in my sister's grade ran up to him, then sang, "Hey, man, do you need an ambulance?" Scott was just crying, then shaking his head yes. The boy then took out his phone and called 911, telling the operator everything that happened. The driver then fell to the ground, took a cell phone out, and began to call someone. He then put it on speaker, and once the person picked up and said hello, he'd been sad, "Mom," to the kid, "so sorry." And he then began to break down in tears, and he just kept repeating that same line over and over again. The driver's mother had tried to calm him down, and then the driver just said, "Please forgive me, please. And even my car, it's a friend's car." Scott just stayed on the ground, lying there, as everyone watched him. The next thing I remember was that Scott always had his mother and brother take him to the bus stop, and they would always make sure he got on, but on this day, they never went with him to the bus stop. I then began to check on my sister, making sure she was okay. Her and her friends seemed a little shaken up, but they were okay. Reed's mom and sister were running up to us, and I remember hugging them. At that moment, I felt so alone and horrified. I began to cry hysterically, and my sister was just trying to comfort me. Something that I always regret was never telling my parents right away about what happened. I didn't want to wake and worry my dad, and I didn't want to get my mom in trouble for leaving early. I knew that she suffered from anxiety, so I didn't want to give her a panic attack, which she would get every once in a while. So, my sister and I just decided to wait there. I remember calling my friend, who I'll call Kara. I remember that her and her mom worked at the school next to ours, and I began to tell her everything that happened. I began to break down. They quickly alerted the front desk, and she calmed me down, telling me everything was going to be okay. I know some of you might be thinking, how was I able to call my friend but not my parents? But during that moment, I just felt the need to call Cindy because she was who I trusted at the time, and we're still friends to this day. About 20 minutes later, the ambulance arrived. They began to check Scott and treat him while he was lying on the ground, still crying and in pain. 10 minutes passed, and I began to come at ease. They started to place him on the stretcher. I remember seeing his mom and brother running with a paramedic towards him, and they had the most worried and horrified faces that I've ever seen. I began to feel so sad for them. Reed, my sister, and I thought it would be okay if we went to school just to try and take our minds off of everything that happened and all of the horror we witnessed 40 minutes ago. We were at our bus stop for almost an hour, and we still got picked up at the next stop and then immediately went to school. I remember the staff waiting there for us and separating the apartment complex bus stop kids, escorting us to the library. I won't go into too much detail, but they pretty much stated that we could stop by the counselor's office anytime during the school day, and if we wanted to leave school, we were able to. After that event, I didn't take the bus for 4 months and was dropped off. I didn't want to cross the street, and whenever I would hear a tire screech, I would always jump and begin to get a cold sweat. A few months later, I began to feel better and continued to live a normal life. After that, Scott didn't go to school until months later, until he was finally okay, towards the end of the year. Like I said, I know this wasn't the typical stalker story, but this was one horrific event that I went through, and I never want to go through it again. But remember to stay safe out there. I really hope many people don't ever have to witness what I and the other kids had to see that day. It was truly awful.